Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Moon's Tears in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 21, Alexithymia. X. Kisuke Urahara, I am going to murder you. Yuriyuki blurred into their training area, electricity cackling and chasing her form. Plum locks stood on end and furious golden eyes blazed like molten lava. In the background of her mind she could feel the others having scattered to the wind when the first lick of Reisu registered. It was fine, the cat's prey was not the other captains and lieutenants, she had eyes only for Kisuke. The blonde hobbled out from behind a collection of rocks, a placating smile on his features and a hand abashedly running through ghost blonde locks. The sight did nothing to quell the burning rage swelling inside of Yuriyuki, and she let it show in the sharp peak of fangs glimmering in her smile. Kisuke had the decency to look afraid as she stalked forward. He also had the intelligence not to run, knowing little to no one could outpace the goddess of Flash. Yuriyuki stared into those apologetic eyes for a tense moment, the air heavy as if before a storm. Lightning fast her hand whipped out, making contact with Kisuke's cheek, the sound ringing throughout the vast spaces of their childhood. Kisuke tottered for a moment, swaying side to side before he fell to the ground, cradling his reddening cheek while his metallic gray eyes stared up at her. Kisuke, how dare you? You just left, no word, no assurances, just a mass scandal and one of those silly little gadgets of yours. I had no idea where you were, and when I tried to contact you I reached another dead end. Then to my utter shock and annoyance I find you here. Training the Hollow Shinigami in this place. Without even telling me. You might as well reserve the couch as your place of residence, Kisuke. The scientist cowered before her might, shame flooding his eyes and his head lowered in apology. Yorichi scoffed, waiting to hear his response. After a quiet few moments where Kisuke tried to gather his rampant thoughts, he looked up into golden orbs, sincerity in his eyes, and said, I'm sorry, Yuriyuki. The storm settled within Yuriyuki. She knew well that Kisuke was one to devolve into long speeches pandering for time as excuses came to mind. Or rather, he would play some fanciful game deriving from what he meant to say. Such simple words quelled her doubts and anger, assuring her that Kisuke meant well and truly what his heart echoed. With a sigh, she hefted him from the ground by the collar of his shiakusho and regarded him with cold, serious eyes, the kind only convicted criminals received. Her tone was frosty and warning as she said, if you ever do this again, Kisuke, I will murder you. The blonde nodded, his understanding hands coming between them to rest, placating and assuring of his conviction. Yuriyuki nodded satisfied and turned her gaze around them, assessing the many Reisu signatures coveted behind the rocks. Ichigo came walking out first, a far too pleased smile curled on his features. He walked over to the two. Yuriyuki eyed him for a moment, contemplative, before a smirk curled on her lips, and she questioned, ready for another race, Ichi? Byakunin's not here to see you lose again. Yuriyuki watched in satisfaction as her taunt sparked a hint of anger in caramel orbs before it was brushed away by an easy smile and a shake of orange locks. Yuriyuki studied Ichigo. It had been a while since she had conversed with the young Shinigami. She had seen him more when Byakuya has been there to tease. He was different from his days in the academy, not largely just small minute details. His orange locks that had caressed his lower back now coiled around his neck. His shoulders were tense, muscle rippling from underneath his shiakusho, where she noted with some surprise the sleeves were pulled back, revealing faint crosses chasing his wrists and neck. It was then her observant eyes noted the two blades on his person. A short blade more akin to a large dagger rested against his hip, and a larger blade's hilt peeked out from behind his back. Then there were his eyes. They had always been the focal point for her attention, such expressive and deep eyes, always drawing one and taking a piece of your soul just as willingly as Ichigo gave his own. They were bare now, whereas before those eyes always reflected his emotions, they were now utterly raw. As if Ichigo couldn't put out what meager shielding he used before. She could see the ache and sleeplessness that clung to his eyes. But a soft light was also there, kind, warm, and familiar in a way she easily recognized. As if I'll let you win this time, Hellcat. Yuriyuki winked at the nickname before an assessing gaze was shot Kisuke's way. She had read the reports, seen some of the evidence, but Ichigo's position had been unclear, and she now wondered if he too had suffered the curse that now plagued the others. It was then left to her thoughts that maybe Kisuke was running the kid into the ground, because she had never seen that level of tiredness cling to his features. As if sensing her concern, Kisuke flashed a slightly assuring smile, even while those metal eyes flashed warningly, so full of an emotion she rarely saw on those sly features. Looking back at Ichigo, the traces of weariness had disappeared under a mask. The others came out separating into small groups chatting amongst themselves. Yuriuki cast her eyes over them taking in these new, she still struggled for the word and the idea of what they were at times stirred instincts ingrained in her since the academy. "Oi, get back to training." Ichigo called over his shoulder at the collective Shinigami. A chorus of groans and grumbling followed his words, but they drew their swords. Yuriuki flinched as she watched them draw hands over their faces, the acidic tang of hollow Reisu filling the air as masks materialized on their features, hiding their humanity from view. Ichigo turned to face Yuriuki, a calming look in his eyes. Yuriuki had never been slow. It's what allowed her to become captain of the second, that piercing wit and intellect. So, she inevitably connected the dots, eyes snapping between the hollow Shinigami and Ichigo, and the bags under his eyes seemed a bit more stark. "Would you like to join us for training, Yuriuki?" Kisuke questioned, offering a tentative hand for her to take, welcoming her into the folds of their group. Yuriuki whirled plum locks for a moment before she nodded, and Kisuke's eyes lit up in that way they did when he was young, and they played in these same grounds. Ichigo smiled as well, flicking a gaze to Kisuke before he affirmed, "We're called the Vizard." She took in the name and his inclusion of them all with a nod before a wicked smirk curled Ichigo's features. He was darting away, a mirror image lightning fast and hard to catch even for her eyes. Yuriuki laughed, traded Kisuke a wink, and followed after the cocky orange head. They sped across the grounds, darting from height to height, the rocky spires mere dust beneath their feet. Ichigo had gotten fast, she thought with a smile, the changed Shiakusho and dual blades, and when did he get dual blades, secretive bastard, leading her to believe that it was partially due to his released blades. The chase began in earnest, her lungs heaving and her Reisu pumping through her veins. Kicking into gear, she began to pick up speed. The air rent apart with great winds as she blew past Ichigo and tapped him on the shoulder, a flash of purple in the distance signifying her passing. She heard laughter behind her, rich and deep, and the echoing burst of Flash Step bursting off the cavern walls. The terror of the chase instilled itself in her heart, rapidly picking up speed and widening a light gold orbs. A soft ripple of cloth had her tense as she spun on her perch high above the ground below, coming to face Ichigo a short distance away. He was panting lightly, orange locks a tangle around his form and eyes glowing light blue with Reisu. "Think ya can keep up, Ichi?" Yuriuki challenged, flicking back errant strands of plum, mocha skin radiant in the warmth of the desert-like climate. Ichigo scoffed and flashed his eyes full of determination and challenge. The young Shinigami blurred out of existence, the after-image fading in the quiet sunlight. It was only years of training and fighting that allowed her to maneuver out of the way of his hand swinging towards her shoulder for a friendly tap. They were off again, back and forth their tag went on as below the Vizard trained, the ringing of blades dulled over the pulse of adrenaline and the beat of her heart. Flipping back onto her hands, a kick narrowly snagged the leg of Ichigo's Shiakusho. Yuriuki settled into a crouch, head cocked in challenge. Ichigo brushed back the tangles of his hair and raised an eyebrow. They shared a small smile. The game finished temporarily, and Yuriuki rose from her crouch, wincing internally at the slight burn of her muscles. She didn't often find a challenge when it came to speed, but Ichigo was an exception. Even Suifon and Byabu weren't a match when it came to the chase. Shaking out the kinks in her muscles like a cat, she sashayed over to Ichigo, poised movement in each step even as her Reisu chided her for the sudden strain. Leaning on the young man's shoulder, the captain of the second flashed Ichigo a coy smirk and said, "I think I won again, Ichi. You'll have to try harder next time." Her taunting and teasing tones sparked a reaction as amber orbs sparked with fire, and a challenging curl of lips met hers even as it faded into a slight frown. Tangerine brows furrowed as Ichigo cast his eyes towards the horizon where the ring of blades still echoed out, bouncing off rocky spires. Nodding her head, Yuriuki pushed down the unease bubbling in her stomach. It was time she confronted the Vizard, captains and lieutenants she'd known for years who suddenly felt like strangers. Looking at Ichigo, she wondered, stared at those amber eyes, and envisioned cold goldens swathed in black, and the shivers that traced her spine weren't imagined. But then he smiled and it was gone, and so assuring that the fear threatening her sanity and composure dispersed. They appeared in the training grounds to a miasma of dust so thick Yuriuki pondered cutting it with her Zanpakuto before it dispersed, and Hirako Teiko was revealed, 2 fingers held in front of him and a sizable crater a few meters away. The blonde was trembling, hand shaking, and the mask covering his features displayed a few cracks, but it remained on his features even as he sunk to his knees. Eyes flipping to Ichigo, she could see a proud light in his eyes as he stalked over to Hirako and crouched in front of the Vizard, words barely audible but traveling in the emptiness of the space. "Finally, Mastered Zero." Hirako nodded and pulled his mask off, dyed eyes bleeding out till those cocky coffee orbs flashed up to Ichigo, a bit hungry and insane, but Shinji's always been a bit insane, or at least tilted, and he nodded before his sly tenor trickles out. Damn, Ichi shoulda warned us about the power, it's intoxicating. Never woulda imagined what it would be like if it wasn't for Ta control. Ichigo's smile was short and sharp, and she thought grief or guilt flashed in his eyes and painted his features for a moment before it was gone, and there was only the warm pride standing stark against the planes of purple under his eyes. Rising from a crouch with Shinji's arm slung over his shoulder, Ichigo's movements were stiff, and she incredulously wondered if he was already injured when she challenged him, and with a grumble and the teasing pokes of the blonde he dragged the captain over to one of the patches of rocks nearby. Shinji flashed Yoriyuki that familiar smile, all teasing and easy gait. She paused and wondered how this had changed everything. It took a moment before she settled her restlessness and decided that maybe nothing has changed. Flashing him the glint of teeth and a wink, Shinji smiled at the acceptance, and his eyes looked that much brighter underneath the waves of golden blonde. Turning her attention back to Ichigo, she watched as he padded over to Love, Zanpakuto sealed, and resting in the simple katana at his waist. The tattoos and flowing crosses of his Kosid were gone, leaving the simple shiakusho that Ichigo always managed to make look regal. He reached out his hand to the man, who accepted the grasp with a firm hold before the two conversed, Ichigo painting a diagram with his hands as he demonstrated the technique. Love nodded in understanding, curly afro bouncing with his movement. He raised his katana, centered it in front of him before with the acidic tang of hollow Reisu he appeared a few feet away. Ichigo stared with critical eyes for a moment, studying his figure with a hand perched under his chin. Love fidgeted before Ichigo called the man over with a wave of his hand and an assuring smile. That was a good sonito, but you're not balancing your Reisu correctly in both feet. You need to feel the movement of your Reisu as if you suddenly put on running shoes. Each step needs to be measured for maximum speed. But you're doing really good, you've come a long way from the first try, so good job. Ichigo finished delivering his speech/lesson, turned watchful eyes on the other visored eyes, catching sight of Lisa's form. He stalked towards her. Yoriyuki cast her own gaze around the training area, trying to spot Kisuke, who had, likely in the desperate hope of easing her wrath, hidden himself away in the labs. The captain of the second remembered then that another scientist or genius or whatever the confusing man was resided in their little group, and the two had likely spent days debating certain topics. She wasn't quite sure on her opinion of the lieutenant of the 5th. Aizen had always rubbed her the wrong way. Underneath the polished gleaming coat of the scholarly academic, his eyes had not been those of a genial man, rather they were like a cobra waiting to strike from the shadows. Yet they had changed from one moment to the next, all with the appearance of a certain orange head, and maybe it took a while, but she had no doubt of the cause. Oh, his eyes were still crafty peaks of amber, but they had lost that cool strictness, and to her, and others, astonishment, the plum-haired captain had seen warmth and a genuine smile. It was conflicting, as she couldn't tell his motives. He was the one who had created the Vizard, and that wasn't in the reports, but she wasn't stupid. One minute he was the mad scientist playing with Kisuke and likely plotting world domination together, the next they both had a forlorn look haunting the intelligence hidden by their eyes, all focused on Ichi. But if Kisuke trusted the kid, and if what she was seeing was any evidence, the kid carried that kind of power. To wrap those around him in his soul, draw them in with a smile, and make them want to stay for a while. Ichi's a good teacher, got ta knack for it, I guess. Yoriyuki turned at Shinji's innocent phrase, honey orbs, zeroing in on Ichigo as he manifested one of the masks in his hand. She could see what Shinji meant. Ichigo had always been that way, even with Byakuya. When they were younger and still attending the academy, she had stumbled on more than a few of their impromptu lessons. He carried a maternal touch in the honest way he cared for people, that in his subtle charisma which twisted around one's soul and easily swayed whoever to Ichigo's new cause. Yeah, he is. Kid's done great so far from what I'm seeing. Shinji stared for a moment and nodded, eyes bright and protective as they chased the speckle of orange hair, almost testing Yoriyuki. Ichigo blocked an incoming Mashiro kick with ease, whipping about to defend against the next attack. Mashiro backflipped and drew her hand over eyes, a mask forming with a swirl of Reisu. Ichigo grinned and raised his Zanpakuto, waiting for her attack. He's a damn scary kid too. Can hold ta 7 of us without his mask on. Then again, he usually reverts to Shikai, though I think that's more showing off. Yoriyuki processed the information wearily, eyes tracing that silver spark slicing through the air. It disappeared in a flash as Ichigo disengaged from Mashiro. With a gentle word and a light push towards Kensei, he began his path over to the collection of rocks they were seated at. A few cuts adorned his skin, one raced across his cheek and the other teased his elbow. But his eyes were different, and it had taken some time, but she thought she was coming to realize what she was seeing. Ichigo was happy. Granted, this wasn't the happiness he displayed in Byakuya and Kaion's presence, this was a joy in the challenge. Beneath that burning light of pride and battle it swirled a dark undercurrent waiting to catch and take under any who looked for too long. A guilt so deep and accompanied by sorrow that if Yoriyuki could, she would wipe it from those soulful eyes. "Are you lazy bags of bones going to join us?" Ichigo questioned, and Shinji began whining teasingly. Ichigo's tense shoulders settled and the darker emotions haunting his amber orbs were subdued as a quiet smile settled on his lips. He offered a hand, and with a last look around them at the family surrounding her, she took it. They had already welcomed her into their folds the moment Ichigo smiled at her and showed her the truth of their little play. Thunder rumbled and bounced, cotton leaves dyed a faded green. Ichigo looked up into the rain where it poured and collected around his figure, tracing his features with the familiarity of a lover's caress. And really, Ichigo thought he was all too familiar with the rain. The air was heavy with Reisu, and Ichigo only sighed as it snaked about, coiling around his form, teasing the breath from his lungs. The water kept rising, and Ichigo knew if he let it his inner world would flood again. A sudden rush of warmth chased away the chill haunting his bones and froze the thoughts of his mind. Old man Zanjitsu sat beside Ichigo, wavy brown locks floating on some invisible breeze dancing with the rain. Shiro rested at Ichigo's feet. Killer yellow orbs watched their surroundings, noting the lack of life in the flora, trees burdened with the sadness of their king. "Ichigo." Zanjitsu spoke softly, eyes heavy from behind the yellow visors perched on his nose. Ichigo looked up, seeing the unspoken words. Their bond thrummed beneath his fingers as pulses of Reisu surged along the cracks in the skyscrapers. They were prompting, telling Ichigo to go forth and open his eyes. Ichigo knew he would have to, but he savored the silence of his inner world and the presence of his soul. There were times traces of that wound like a ghost came to chase his limbs. When he had been alone, so utterly despairing in the loss of his soul, powers, and far much more than he cares to think about. Shiro growled, startling the thoughts away. His gaze landed on Ichigo, seeming to say, "Damn pansy king," even as the cadence of Shinigami Reisu ruffled his locks fondly. Zanjitsu Asen looked Ichigo in the eyes, and the young Shinigami nodded wearily. Outside their world, secreted from view, time was frozen, blades raised challengingly against Ai Sosuke. Ichigo had fled at the terror in his heart and mind as it overwhelmed him for that one moment, ran to his spirits and the haven of skyscrapers, blossoming trees. Amber orbs were revealed as Ichigo dissolved from his inner world. Reisu chasing away the lingering dredges of memory, he gazed into Sosuke's coffee-colored eyes, calm and ready to fight. They were different from the crazed eyes of a madman, and Ichigo cemented his thoughts in that, focusing on Sosuke, not Aizen, as he had come to differentiate between the two. They nodded, minute and perfect, to the only viewer of their sudden battle in the twilight hours of the morning. Kisuke nodded from where he was settled in the distance, eyes shadowed under a cloak of darkness. They sprung forward, blades sealed within their hands and the wisps of air around them. Like the toll of a clock they clashed, blades ringing, and Ichigo settled into the motion, banishing all thoughts of that colossal form, sweeping wings, and white everywhere, choking his sight. Kyoka Suijutsu swept out towards his head and Ichigo ducked. Zanjitsu whipped up to defend, even as his fist shot out was an attempt to render his opponent incapable of moving. Sosuke slid back, Kyoka Suijutsu falling short beside him. They regarded each other tensely, cast before shooting forward once more. Ichigo swung overhead as Kyoka Suijutsu winked into existence, stopping the blade on its path. Ichigo switched trajectory, aiming for the pale column of Sosuke's neck. Sosuke whipped around, blade a peak of light as it cleaved a path towards Ichigo's legs. Flipping back, the two paused, and Sosuke intoned, "Quite restless tonight, Ichigo." The comment was a jest at Ichigo's strength raging behind his shields and the tampered Reisu of his blade. Ichigo merely raised an eyebrow. Zanjitsu purred in his hands as they shot forward. Back and forth across the deserted land, cool winds of night nipped their cheeks and pulled aside their heavy robes. Ichigo settled into the motion, feeling the tense weight of the past few days settle as the familiar motions of swordplay ingrained themselves within his movements. It had been altogether strange teaching the ones who had first drilled the lessons into his head. He sometimes mused he could hear their voices in his head correcting the same mistakes he saw in their youthful figures that they saw once upon a time in him, and they were younger. During a warrior eyes aged 1,000 years in one night, weighing the lines of one's face and casting starkness to all features. They were captains and lieutenants, so of course they carry that with them already, but it was nothing to the visage of a veteran that had seen hell itself frozen and survived. Shaking away the thoughts, Ichigo swirled away from Aisosuke and swept Zanjutsu out to catch some of the earth. He flung it towards the temporarily stunned lieutenant. Sosuke appeared from behind. Instinct snapped at him as he protected his back, crouching and pivoting on one foot to bring an elbow towards his jaw. They've changed so much already, his mind supplied as he thought of their earlier training session. Maybe he thought it was because he never knew them in the beginning, but some part of his heart whispered that he helped change them for the better. When he first met them, he was young and brash, unknowing of the world inside himself and around them. They had been jaded and bitter with both Soul Society and Aizen. They had become so ingrained with one another in their isolation that in some respects it was like Soul Society breeding stagnation with no room for growth. Then they had been pardoned, rejoined the Godi 13, and both sides began to see change in measure. Ichigo wondered if that was the plot of Yamgi all along, because as old as the man was, he wasn't an idiot. You didn't find warriors that old, dull of mind, or without some strategy always at hand. It sometimes bit at his heart and head when Ichigo thought of all the manipulations sustained throughout his life, the deceit and blatant lies from his family, friends, even his enemies. But that was the past as much as it was the future, and Ichigo had learned to let it go. He couldn't hold grudges against the dead, and it was pointless when the act was not yet committed. Still, a part of Ichigo knew that it wasn't only Kisuke and Aizen playing the chessboard. Swinging his thoughts back to the Vizard even as Zanjutsu jerked up to block an incoming strike, Ichigo thought of this new bond they shared. It was as Shinji said, they were family. Molded and glued together through their experiences and the training they had undertaken. The Vizard were vibrant and happy, even though they now had to contend with the dark side, and they had welcomed Ichigo, taken his training and words to heart. The thoughts warmed his heart and helped brighten his eyes, because he knew this was only a stepping stone and there were many more trials ahead of him. The mere idea of all he would have to soon deal with gave him a headache and weighed his heart like the sorrow of his past only could. Because it would always bite at his confidence, the thought of once again failing those he loved. The thought of the future weighed heavy on his mind and stirred a restlessness in his heart that he couldn't seem to subdue even with the warmth of their Reisu. It was near bliss, he thought quietly, to be in a room with them, feel their like Reisu full of raging instinct and the quiet mold of Hueco Mundo. For years as he had stood behind Shunsui at meetings and other social gatherings, he had felt their presences empty and lacking like many others that he had known in the future, but all the more so in comparison to the Vizard he knew. It wasn't that restlessness that had dragged him from his false imitation of slumber. He knew the others would worry if they saw what he did at night, stare at the empty cave walls and reminisce like an old man without sake. But to close his eyes and let the warm wash of sleep cover him was akin to submerging himself in the icy vestiges of water, dark and murky, that formed his mindscape when it was left to run free. There was no way to tear himself from those clawed grasps, and he didn't want to burden the others, not when it was them he saw over and over again as pale bloated corpses or charred figures. This time it was a presence strange and yet familiar, like cool oil it brushed against his senses, choking the breath teasingly from his lungs, not for its overwhelming power but the strange malign ants that resonated with undercurrents of empathy. It had chilled Ichigo, chased away any lingering sense of calm that his semi-meditative state had introduced, and left him feeling as if the room had dropped several degrees. Before his mind could catch up with his body, he was embracing the days of his youth, the constant brashness and running headfirst into whatever situation, and was on his feet, Zanjutsu clenched firmly in his fist. He had swept out of the caves into the cavernous training area where night's shadows cast the forest of rocks like that of the Minos forest. Ichigo pushed down the bitter tint of bile that those memories sometimes stirred, even as an aged scar pulsed at the center of his chest. That oily Reisu had swirled, rising around him and chasing the shadows of night, wishing to suppress Ichigo, or embrace him. The orangutan couldn't tell the dizzying mix of emotions and will represented so alike to his own turbulent catastrophe of emotions. He had let his Reisu respond, rising around him in faint peaks of red that sparked with the deadly flint of night. Then it was gone with a whisper on the sable-cloaked sky and a bright cadence of Reisu that had Ichigo gasping, sliding down to rest on the ground before his head tilted forward to rest against his knees, orange locks shielding his eyes from sight. The young lieutenant had sat for who knows how long, shivering not from the chill of night but the unidentified presence that had shaken him so, felt their Reisu far before they actually appeared, their soft murmurs drifting on the breeze as Kisuke exited, followed by Aizen. It was likely that the two had finally pulled themselves from their latest craze in the lab, but Ichigo found the alternative far more truthful if the sly glances from under the brim of a cowl were any indication. Lifting his head up so he could tilt it back, he looked at the sky, wishing for the reassuring presence of the moon. The soft hum of Zanjitsu dispersed that longing, and he had with some reluctance turned his gaze to the two men seated a short distance away. Zanjitsu's sealed form rested in his lap. Ichigo took a breath to calm his racing heart and settle the irritant bud of instinct that sparked like adrenaline in his system. Sosuke had smirked, tipped those glasses that he still kept perched on the bridge of his nose away, and handed them to Kisuke. He had learned that the man did actually require them when it came to the lab work. Kisuke had only shot the man a cautionary look in a little hand gesture that was lost on Ichigo before he took the black frames, perched them on his nose, and settled back to watch the show. Ichigo had contemplated denying the challenge, but he was still restless after the events not long ago, and Zanjitsu was practically baying for blood at the thought of fighting Sosuke. His reminiscing was cut short as Sosuke's blade swung a deadly arc towards Ichigo's neck, swinging up with wind-breaking speed. The two pieces of metal intercepted with a loud clash. Dust was kicked up into the air, flying on heavy gales as carefully controlled power began to unravel. Springing back, Ichigo panted for breath, drawing life into his lungs. He looked up from shadowed bangs to glimpse Sosuke's figure. The man was also hunched over, gaze locked onto Ichigo, deep satisfaction haunting coffee orbs, and the pale beads of his effort dotted his forehead. "I am now quite certain that I don't regret my decision to accept your offer, Ichigo." The words were a gunshot in the ensuing silence, and Ichigo accepted the words with a raised eyebrow. He knew that this was a far better alternative to Aizen's delusions of grandeur and becoming a deity. For now, Sosuke had found companionship in both intellect and strength. Kyoka Suijutsu no longer howled her loneliness, instead she was content with the will of her wielder. "Though I can't help but wonder at your own happiness, Ichigo." It was a simple statement, but struck Ichigo all the same. Was he not hiding this ever-present sorrow? He tried to shield those potent emotions behind high walls so that they wouldn't hurt the others. But it was altogether too hard, when day after day relentlessly he was forced to see the dead walk. To live, breathe, eat, sleep, and talk with them stirred memories both fond and horrifying. Aizen took Ichigo's silence for an answer and hefted his katana and challenge. "Eyes bright," he said, "allow me to distract from your sorrow." Ichigo smiled a tiny bit sharp and feral as he accepted the challenge. His insomnia-crazed mind was tired of hiding. With a nod, they were charging forward once more, the ringing clash of blades resuming the deathly orchestra. Ichigo swung overhead, flowing away even as his strike was blocked. He twisted and ducked narrowly under the sharp slice of air. Channeling his Reisu through his fingers, Ichigo aimed at Aizen from under where Zanjitsu was locked with Kyoka Suijutsu and let loose a low-powered Byakurai. Sosuke twisted away from the Kido and disengaged their blades before darting in once more, Kyoka Suijutsu gleaming like a celestial force. Ichigo flicked his blade up to catch the incoming attack and swirled to the side. Zanjitsu followed his movement. He swung at Sosuke's unprotected side, eyes keen on the swirl of brown eyes. He flipped back to avoid a cut aimed for his chest. Letting Zanjitsu rest in front of him, Ichigo channeled a large portion of his Reisu into the blade, watching as tendrils of ebony heralded his devastating attack. "Getsuga Tensho." A whisper before the oncoming storm of Reisu that surged forth with the howling fury of a god. Ichigo registered the widening of Koko orbs before Sosuke was enswathed in folds of ebony, filling the midnight blue sky with darkness. It dispersed with a pulse of light blue Reisu as Sosuke staggered from the attack, panting for breath but still standing, eyes alight. There was challenge in those eyes, as if he wanted to see more of the power Ichigo kept behind a seal. Ichigo wondered if the lieutenant was going to faint before, with a whisper of steel, the figure in front of him was gone. Ichigo blinked before a smile lilted on his lips, and Zanjitsu shot up to intercept the blade crawling towards his neck. Reisu lapsed around Sosuke's form, rising and curling in challenge. Ichigo's eyes brightened with determination, and hues of crimson and ebony began to dance around him. Back and forth they shot across the sky, blades whirling with the combined might of will and Reisu. Kisuke watched from below, keen eyes analyzing the battle and Reisu, even as Benihime cajoled him to join in. Bloodlust began to rise in his ears, overtaking the marching beat of his heart. Ichigo didn't flinch as Kisuke appeared behind him, blade unsheathed, and Benihime's familiar call of bloodlust crowing throughout the air in heady gales. Zanjitsu rumbled in content, echoing Ichigo's own thoughts as the blade flicked down. Ichigo tilted back to avoid a side sweep from Sosuke. Ichigo darted behind Kisuke and flung his blade toward the blonde's neck. Kisuk swayed to the side. Benihime flowed up with casual grace to intercept the metal. Sosuke had a small frown tilting his lips before those eyes lit up manically, and he charged forward, blade swinging towards Ichigo. Pushing down the pressuring instincts that pulsed within in his blade, Ichigo slipped away from Kisuk, keeping the captain in his peripheral view even as he braced himself for Sosuke's attack. The brunette crashed into Ichigo with the force of a building, waves of Reisu crashing against him with the devastating power of a tsunami. Ichigo balanced precariously against the sudden force, arms heavy with tiredness shook with Zanjutsu to divert the power. A devious light tickled his thoughts, and before Sosuke could prepare himself, Ichigo was gone. The man was left unbalanced and tilted forward slightly. Kisuk gave Ichigo no respite and was instantly in his space. Benihime sailed towards his chest. Zanjutsu zipped up to intercept the insatiable blade slower than Ichigo would have liked. In reward, a thin mark of red traced his collarbone, the dull feeling of liquid registering against his senses even as he flicked back the oncoming assailant. Pushing back the tangled mass of sweat-soaked bangs, Ichigo gazed out upon the two scientists, and they regarded each other with light animosity. Ichigo's muscles burned, chiding him for the strain he was near constantly putting them through with the training and this battle. Channeling his training forged in the mud in times of fire, from behind his back Ichigo charged a Getsuga Tensho. With a sharp flick, the blade was in front of him, a wheeling arc of power surging forth to slam into the surprised Shinigami. From within the cloud of dust, Ichigo charged the tangy and playful Reisu that was Kisuk's. Stark as Benihime's shield fell away in the gales of power her release had ensued. With a chiding smile, Ichigo shook his head in amusement and continued on his path. Sosuke reacted quickly, Kyoka Suijutsu snapping up to block the lethal blade. Even as Ichigo's Reisu surged from his fist coveted behind his back, it drilled towards Kisuk. Benihime caught the energy and redirected it towards Ichigo. Sosuke took that moment to begin chanting a high-level Kido while Kyoka Suijutsu surged forward to cut Ichigo. Ichigo bore the brunt of the attacks with little damage, his iero and blood vein absorbing and transferring the pain to where he could continue to fight. Panting for breath at the large expenditures of energy Ichigo had released from what the seal permitted, Ichigo tilted Zanjutsu to face the ground, surrendering to the elder Shinigami. Ichigo flopped upon the rocks boneless, and the thrill and rush of battle faded from his body, and he was left with the burn of muscle and the coolness of night touching damp skin. A nameless terror instilled itself in his mind. For a moment his slowly calming breathing picked up erratically before the soft hum of Zanjutsu sealed the rampant feelings away. Kisuk and Sosuke touched down beside him. The three sprawled upon the rocks and gazing upon the night skies above. The two began talking in quiet whispers, lulling and soothing to Ichigo. It reminded him of days in the lab with Kisuk where they would hunch over their next project. Grease would cake their skin and mat their hair, and spare pieces of junk would dig into their sides. Kisuk would begin to ramble about whatever invention or theory would catch his fancy, and he would talk. For hours on end the man could go, his gravelly voice pulling Ichigo into slumber. It was the same now as he felt the weight of the day and their training heavy on his eyelids. He thought that they likely plotted this knowing the two, and he acknowledged that it was likely with the best intentions. Tire him out with a fight so he could get some sleep. Ichigo wished it would work, but he knew that it would take a whole other level of exhaustion. The kind he saw when they trained in the King's Realm in between the fighting. Because as much as one could patch a hole in the fabric that separated that world from Soul Society, it would never be the same, and it didn't help that Hashwalth was damn good when it came to barriers. With a soft sigh Ichigo surrendered. For a moment darkness overtook his vision and the content hum of chatter became a lullaby. It didn't last. He could feel the sharp pull of nightmare threading him if he let himself drift further in the currents of Morpheus' realm. With a peal of Reisu, Ichigo opened his eyes and took in a few deep breaths, washing back the dredges of faces scarred with death. Kisuk and Sosuke shared concerned glances but said nothing, and for that Ichigo was all the more thankful. "Ichi, would you consider taking a sleep aid?" Kisuk questioned softly, concern in his voice and a paternal or brotherly warmth in his eyes. Ichigo paused and considered his answer, thinking of the multiple remedies that had been developed in the future. He had tried them in a wish to escape for even a surreal moment. Instead he was trapped within his dreams, no way of escape. Shaking his head, eyes filled with gratitude, he responded, "Thank you, but I'm alright. I've had bad experiences with sleep aids." Kisuk slumped and Sosuke looked slightly disappointed, but Kisuk gazed into Ichigo's amber orbs and seems to accept the honesty for what it was. Sinking back against the hard surface, Ichigo's eyes traveled to the constellations above. Following the familiar figures of his childhood, he drifted into a relaxed state. His thoughts came and went on soft currents and he let them acknowledge the whimsies of his mind but not dwelling or forcing on them, thoughts of their training, the familiarity of their interactions. Ichigo, what do you believe will happen when we return? This time it was Sosuke, and Ichigo regarded the man who was displaying a rare case of hesitancy before he replied. The Vizard will be accepted as the Suteiko has decreed. There will be unrest and likely rebellion, but on the political scale having one of the Shiba's main family members tilts the odds in our favor, not to mention the grace of the Shihoin clan head. We will settle into life, but it will be different than before. For one, the Vizard have increased power levels. Some might see this as a challenge and begin training. Others might choose to leave our ranks. It is the future and as unpredictable as our own lives. Sosuke nodded and Kisuke looked minutely shocked at hearing Ichigo speak so much before he shook the expression away. Silence descended one more, though this time a thoughtful silence as the three pondered the words spoken. Sosuke looked up and stared for a moment before he leaned in to speak to Kisuke. They talked for a hush moment, all the while at random intervals their gaze landed on Ichigo suspiciously. Ichigo, are you from the future? Sosuke questioned softly, albeit hesitantly, staring consciously at Ichigo, eyes bright. Ichigo paused, eyes wide, and his heart stammered in his chest. He knew he had given them more than a few clues as to the truth behind his facade, but for the normally manipulative man to be so blunt was a slight shock. Quiet reigned for a time as Ichigo pondered his answer, Zanjutsu sending assuring waves of Reisu through their bond. That's your second question, Sosuke. Ichigo flashed Sosuke a teasing smile, calming the man's worries before he continued. I am from the future, or rather a future. What happened? Kisuke questioned solemnly, with only a glimmer of the normal curiosity peeking through the dark metal gray of his eyes. Sosuke's eyes were sharp as they locked onto Ichigo, seeing the sorrow prevalent in warm chocolate orbs hidden under a crown of orange. I lost, in the end. Ichigo tilted his head back to look at the sky, taking calm from the starry sky above as his emotions rustled beneath his skin. Their understanding was almost tangible at his freely given confirmation. Brushing his hair to the side, Ichigo gripped Zanjutsu, taking a breath of the crisp night air. He rose to his feet. Finally turning to face his companions of the night, Ichigo saw the two sprawled on the rock, a bottle of sake resting between the two, already half drained. Tipping his head in farewell, Ichigo parted the silence. Good night. The two Shinigami looked up, eyes dark and pensive, saying their farewell with a nod. Shedding the hard shell of his facade, he let the torrent of his emotions shine through his eyes for a brief moment. With a flutter of thick cloth around his ankles, Ichigo turned and returned to the darkness of the cave, stealing one last glimpse at the sky. X. Chapter 22, Rame. X. The music drifted out from the turntable. It was a newer model with the broad disc of shining sable, the sometimes scratchy quality accompanying it. They all turned a blind eye as to how the device appeared, knowing well that Shinji had one in his office, and that it was likely still there, which seemed to indicate an unpermitted view to the human world. But as was said before, no one seemed to care about the small breach in protocol. A male singer's voice bounced and echoed off the cavernous walls, magnified 100 times over and adding an altogether interesting quality to the music. It was some musician from America, if Ichigo recalled correctly, from what little he knew of the time there in America. The jaunty tune accompanied well the content atmosphere of the quiet evening after a day spent training with fruitful results. Ichigo was curled in one of the corners where a swath of silks and fabrics were thrown around and over him so that he felt partially obscured like the living dead residing in the tombs of Egypt. Love was sitting at the end of a sofa within arm's reach, a magazine in his grasp and his head tilted to listen to the music. Rose was curled beside him, lightly strumming the strings of his guitar to the rhythm of the singer's voice. Shinji was curled like a cat perched on one of the alcoves set into the walls. He looked on from above, watching over all like a god. A content look rested in his eyes even as Hiyori whined at him from below her perch on a myriad of pillows, precarious. Lisa let out an irritated huff, flashing a glare at Hiyori from over the rim of her horned glasses before she returned to her novel, settled beside Haki. The large man with bubblegum bright hair was holding his hands in front of him, spirit energy like the delicate strands of gossamer threads that a spider wielded stretched out in front of him. The glowing green threads formed intricate mandala patterns, the lines seemingly never ending as they flowed from one form to the next. Ichigo could almost read the purpose in Haki's Reisu at the script presented to them. Each ring or pattern was enforced with a kido of some kind, though Ichigo suspected it was far more likely for them to reside in shielding. The intricately woven threads of the Kido formed a strength uncommonly seen in a normally cast Kido. Tessai watched on from across Haki. His braided hair caught the light of the oil lamps in a way that drew the eyes as he stared pensively at Haki's creation. Ichigo had never thought on it before in his own timeline, but it was quite obvious now. The Kido Corps were not to be underestimated. In Aizen taking the two high-ranking members from Soul Society, he had effectively crippled their ranks more than most would know. The Orange Head kindly thought of his many and vast attempts at learning Kido, from training with Jushiro, to construction with Haki, and high-level spells with Tessai. He humorlessly thought of their dumbstruck expressions at the multitude of ways Kido had failed him. Mashiro let out a happy bubble of laughter, drawing Ichigo's eyes towards her. The lime-haired lieutenant was seated on Kensei's lap, the gray-haired man looking distinctly uncomfortable at the close contact. The childish lieutenant was babbling on about whatever inane subject in a way that reminded Ichigo fondly of Orium. His heart let out a pang in his chest when he thought of the ditzy brunette in her many astounding food combinations. Her death had hit him hard, but Uriah even harder. Ichigo pushed away those thoughts and the vile twinge of bile that burned his throat and heart. He cast his eyes over to Kisuke, who was flipping through a thick stack of paper while every once in a while lifting his head to confer with Sosuke. Yuriyuki was draped over Kisuke, the man expertly moving about even as a wave of deep purple locks tickled the back of his neck. Sosuke was leaning back against one of the seats, a worn tome in his hands and his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, taking away the sly look from his figure. Ichigo gazed upon the scene with a small smile twined on his lips and bright eyes. He felt calm in a way that had been absent during the heavy dust of the daylight. This content aura of community and family was something he had missed. The solace one found in a friend was quite different from the kindling of unity. Each was valuable in their own way. Zanjitsu purred contentedly in the background of his mind, echoing the harmony of his soul. Letting out an inaudible sigh, Ichigo flicked his eyes back to the novel in his hands. The tome had a dusty red cover faded with age and the pages were in some areas smudged. It was one of the books he had recently borrowed from the vast archives, in which, to be truthful, he had made another midnight visit to the Grand Palace of Books, much to Sosuke's chagrin without the enigmatic man. The lieutenant had been soothed when Ichigo had pulled out a few thick tomes that he knew the scientist would like and tossed them into the spectacled lieutenant's lap. Hence the man absorbed by the book in the corner, only able to spare a minute for Kisuke to converse about whatever new founding or theory. Translating the text as he read, Ichigo frowned as the letters began to dance across the page, becoming slightly blurry. Rubbing away the sleep from his eyes, which made itself noticed dully in the ache of his muscles and the heaviness of his eyes, where it felt a valiant struggle to keep them open and read the next page. Ichigo contented himself for a moment with the thought that their training was nearing its end, and with it Ichigo could hopefully try and gain some rest. Shiro growled his affirmation of the plan. Already the orange-haired Shinigami had spent just over an hour listening to his two spirits nag him about taking care of himself. Ichigo even agreed with them, sometimes though it was hard to break old habits. It didn't help that he had been recovering, however slowly, but that had all been thrown back in his face the moment he had damned himself to spending a month in close proximity to the Vizard. A shudder passed his spine at the thought of Anohana's wrath when she found out how well he had taken care of himself since their last visit. The rush of adrenaline that the mere thought of the terrorist captain of the Fourth induced, allowed him to open his eyes where they had drifted shut. Turning the page, Ichigo began reading the sprawling script that seemed to bounce across the page. The novel detailed, from what Ichigo could gather, ways in which one might manipulate the barriers of Reisu regarding the tricky state of time. Soft chatter rose up around him, accompanied by the musician's deep voice, and Ichigo sunk into quiet state of relaxation. Some time later, Ichigo set the novel down, a pensive look cast on his features as he thought over what he had just read. It took his mind a few minutes to comprehend the complexity of the words, and absently he opened their yellowed page once more. Raking ember orbs over the words akin to chicken scratch, Ichigo waited for his mind to catch up. Within 1 second and the next he set his book down with a small peak of dust and was on his feet with a whirl of orange locks. His quick flurry of movements garnered a few looks, but they soon turned their attention elsewhere, all that is except for Kisuke, whose metallic gray eyes were pinning Ichigo in place for a moment. Flinging aside the man's curious gaze, Ichigo swept away on a mission to find more than a few resources hidden somewhere nearby. His return a few minutes later gathered no more attention than his exit, except he could now feel Sosuke's inquisitive stare from behind the frames perched on the bridge of his nose. Pushing aside their gazes, Ichigo settled once more into the nest of silks and spread the collection of papers and leather-bound books in front of him. Flipping at random through the pages, Ichigo began mumbling under his breath as he tried to recall where he had seen the information before. Absently he brushed away stray strands of orange as he picked up one of the journals he used to record ideas and thoughts. Or at least that was what he replied with to Kaion's incessant questioning. In reality they often contained parables of the future or speculation upon things that were far-reaching even for this time. Letting out a sigh, Ichigo's gaze was drawn to the one tome he hadn't yet opened. It looked the same as the day he had found it in the antiques shop, with rusted yellow pages, a cracked spine, and a heavy Reisu submerged in its skin. Eyes flicking up hurriedly to gaze at his companions, Ichigo settled whatever irrational emotion was tingling at the base of his skull and cracked open the book. "Find what ya lookin' for, Ichi?" Ichigo's eyes raised from the heavy scratch of ink to lazily drag along the cave walls before landing on Shinji. The captain was staring curiously, eyes wide, and the smirk so Cheshire in nature curled upon his lips. With a responding tilt of his lips, Ichigo shook his head and returned his focus to the pages, leaving a nonverbal response in his wake. After a time of silence, Ichigo let out a pleased hum. Settling the book on his lap, he picked up the red-bound book and compared the two novels side by side. The evidence was there, and Ichigo was both pleased in proving that he was indeed still sane of mind, and confused by the meaning of his findings. Slowly, as the strands of an idea began to connect, his hands weaved in front of him. The text suggested plausible ways for one to traverse time and space, and as of yet Ichigo could still not see reason behind his appearance in this timeline. It resided at the tip of his tongue, as if right in front of his eyes, but no matter what, he could not yet see it. Shiro's coarse laughter echoed teasingly in the back of his mind, and Ichigo shook his head fondly at his spirit's actions. So preoccupied by his thoughts and the still drifting currents of Reisu, Ichigo was blind to the approach of the two scientists in the room. It was only after Sosuke flared his Reisu that Ichigo deigned to look up at the curly-haired lieutenant. Crouched beside him was Kisuke, staring intently at Ichigo rather than the collection of volumes placed before Ichigo. Releasing another sigh, Ichigo met determined gray eyes before catching Sosuke's own. With a deft flick of his hand he reversed the novel, so they could see the pages Ichigo had been gazing at for an undetermined amount of time. Knowing it would be unwise to let the two gaze at the works for too long, else they embrace their inner kleptomaniac, Ichigo closed the books together with a soft snap, startling the two out of whatever meditative state of wisdom they had entered. There was a peculiar look in Kisuke's eyes, as if he was asking Ichigo a question yet at the same time begging silence. With a faint roll of his eyes, Ichigo settled back and lifted his hands in front of him. In slow movements, with a regulation of carefully controlled breaths, Ichigo allowed a thin beam of Reisu to rest horizontally in front of them. The bar of Reisu divided until in a skewed perspective it formed a shape similar to a cube. Accompanying the raven lines of Reisu, a thin bead of red danced along the cage. It was a simple method to display what he was beginning to grasp, but the message was received, even as admiration at the technique Ichigo showed glimmered in Sosuke's coffee-colored eyes. Deciding to take their little diagram to the next level, he allowed the beam of red to bounce out of its boundaries, in some cases dividing and multiplying. From these beads of red, spirals of blue reached out to touch beads of green. Thin lines of blue seemed to suddenly stretch around them, reaching over their heads, tangling around their hands and tickling their noses. The faint prickle of Ichigo's Reisu underlaid the faint scent of something indescribable. Then they were gone in a colossal fade of small sparks as the single red bead at the center blinked out to that of an ember. Haki and Tessai were gazing at Ichigo appreciatively, a speculative light in Tessai's eyes. It was likely they had sensed Ichigo's rather unique way in which he wielded his Reisu to form such imagery. Pushing aside those idle thoughts and the confusion of the other wizard, he turned his eyes on the two men in front of him who were beginning to comprehend the message behind Ichigo's impromptu story. Fortune surely has picked a favorite, Ichi-chan. Ichigo smirked at Kisuke's chiding yet teasing tone, knowing the man could barely understand the truth of the matter but was beginning to grasp its concept. Sosuke tangled a hand through his hair, eyes still pensive even as he shifted restless where he stood. Ichigo collected the miasma of papers that had sprawled everywhere from the neat stack between one moment and the next, just as a female singer came on. Her voice was light and airy in a way that left that sensation of flying, or perhaps falling. "Ichiberry, how come we never see your Kido skills?" Mashiro questioned suddenly, lime locks bouncing around her ears as she sauntered over to gaze down at him, bending at the waist. Kisuk took that as his K to make a tactical retreat and slipped into the chair nearby where Yoryuki proceeded to wrap around the man like a cat, ghost blonde hair disappearing under a curtain of plum-colored hair. Sosuke looked contemplatively at his seat set an ample distance away before with a slight tilt of his brow he reclined against one of the walls waiting for Ichigo's answer. Rubbing a hand behind his head in slight abashment, Ichigo thought of his many attempts to even wield the ability to cast Kido. Brushing back traumatic memories of days spent trying to learn, Ichigo answered, "It's really not my forte. I'm better suited to cast higher level Kido with my levels of Reisu, and they usually take too long if I want to cast them correctly." Mashiro nodded happy with the answer and returned her attention to Kensei once more. Much to Lisa's disappointment at the ensuing bubble of noise, the lieutenant flipped a page in her magazine rather loudly in her typical passive-aggressive manner. Tessai looked like he was considering strolling over to talk to Ichigo, and the orangutan in question thanked the heavens when Haki intervened. The large Kido master pulled his commander to the side where they proceeded to speak in hushed tones. Sinking back against the walls, Ichigo felt the ebb and flow of the Reisu around him. Closing his eyes, he could almost see the particle soft light dancing and swirling like brilliant grains of sand carried by the wind. Colors swirled and weaved interchangeably, the very being of the souls around him intermingling, dancing, and following the endless flow of life. The sight kindled his own Reisu to reach forward from where it hovered around him, always aware of what they possessed. The light behind his eyes grew brighter still as Reisu peaked with the warmth of their souls, radiating happiness. A kind smile faintly traced his lips at the sensation. Opening his eyes, he blinked, adjusting to the warm glow of the oil lamps. He let his eyes rest heavily on nothing, the rough walls of the cave serving as a simple canvas for his thoughts. They came like spears poking and prodding, asking him to think and to ponder. So much was happening, beginning and ending within such short time. They would soon disembark from their sabbatical with powers new to Soul Society, or rather the three worlds. Just so this time of peace, lazy contentedness was drawing to a close, and the thought left a pang in his heart. Idly fingering a lock of orange in his hand, Ichigo winced thinking of the Shiba's reactions when he returned. The young Shinigami grimaced at the thought of Kukeku's spoon, which was wielded with force alike to the Captain Commander's Bankai. Ganja would probably cast those puppy eyes, the ones that instantly stirred guilt in his heart, so like his own sister's attempts, which always succeeded. It was Kaien who was the variable. He would either be a blubbering mess, or iced fire ready to sink Nijibana into his thick skull. Thinking of his ebony-haired double reminded Ichigo how much he missed his family. As much as spending time with the Vizard was healing in its own way, that sense of community and their Reisu surfacing from the dust kindled his heart like fire. It was also terribly lonely in a way they couldn't yet comprehend. It sometimes stretched his pride to admit that he depended on Kaien and Byakuya, but he was grateful nonetheless for their presence. Pushing aside the adjacent feelings to Zanjutsu Asen's slight disapproval, Ichigo comforted the older spirit. A reverberating growl sounded through his mind, and Ichigo raised his eyebrows in surprise as the dual-tone voice trickled along the seams of their bond. "Damn king. Ya need to take better care of yourself. Look at ya moping like a lost teenager." Ichigo winced. That was a low blow even for his Zanpakuto. Then again, he could expect nothing but honesty from them in the end. For one's soul did not lie to them. Pushing aside the slight swell of bitterness those words dredged up, Ichigo responded, "Once this ordeal is over I rest. Then again they do say I'll sleep when I'm dead, though that might not apply in this situation." The orange head could almost sense the albino spirit's disbelief at his words, but Ichigo shook it off. Turning his mind to Zanjutsu Asen, Ichigo waited to hear what the older spirit would say, having remained quiet during their common spats. "Ichigo, remember what has happened before, the worry you caused your family. Even so, you need to prepare yourself to return." Ichigo accepted the older spirit's words, watching all the while as life passed on around him. As he reached to push a stray lock behind the shell of his ear, an impulsive idea struck him, something almost heralding the days of his youth. The orangutan could sense the wave of amusement simmering within Zanjutsu Asen, and the gleeful cackle that bounced around his mindscape was all too indicating of Shiro's position. A piercing would certainly be a change of pace, however minute, and maybe he needed a change. It would certainly be indicative of his time with the Vizard, and of his own history. For however much he would like to deny it, he was once considered a punk. Whether it was the scowl or the constant street brawls was a debatable topic, but relevant nonetheless. It certainly didn't help that the decision to get a piercing was rather impulsive and all too much like his youth. For as much as Ichigo would like to say he was that brash kid who rushed into everything head first but heart in the right place, it was different now. Oh, he still held that stubbornness, hence the determination to receive a piercing, and his loyalty to all he considered under his protection. But he also took the time to plan, think about the consequences, and sometimes he wondered when he had truly lost humanity and naivete to have it replaced with this fractured soul. Tilting away from the precarious danger that his thoughts all fell to eventually, Ichigo considered his idea in depth. He wondered for a brief moment if it would reflect negatively on the clan before the thought of the geezers, who by now had very little power due to something of a coup, the cause remained unknown, sparked a carnivorous smile to curl on his lips. No, the real matter would be Ishine, who served as the clan head in Kaion. It sometimes weighed on him that he had to make decisions and consider the clan. By the third quarter of the war the nobles had been nothing, no one had cared if he decided to curse up a clan head for being an idiot. It elevated him in a balance as well. Having a whole clan and family was far different from the small bubble he had known all his life, and such a family as the Shibas, no matter how overbearing they are, was far better than the Kukaki family stuck on poise. Tilting his head to the side with a slightly devious smirk curling his lips, Ichigo let his gaze cast around the room before landing on Love. In his own timeline, he had found out the man was a closet genius when it came to matters of fashion. He could sew, cut hair, and apply makeup in astonishing ways. Ichigo had chalked it up to the Vizard having far too much free time and their inherent eccentricity before dismissing the notion. The thought pervaded and his gaze sharpened in interest regarding the man. He could always do it himself, having performed more than a few hasty surgeries on the fly. He held finesse with a needle to rival Uryu, no matter the man's fierce argument against such. But he would much rather have someone else try rather than glimpse into the image of still water. As if feeling fiery, Amber Orb's Love paused in his conversation with Rose, angling himself slightly so that he could face Ichigo. Rose peeked from the side, curly blonde hair framing his features as his fingers drummed the beat of the music. In a slightly abashed manner, Ichigo tilted his head and shrugged. An easy smile slipped onto Love's features. The calm man shifted into a relaxed position, ignoring Rose's squawking as the abrupt movement tilted the dramatic blonde slightly and he struggled to regain his balance, guitar tipping like a beam on a scale. "What's got such an intense expression on your features there, Ichi?" The black-haired man questioned, the shades covering his eyes glinting in the glowing atmosphere of the room. Ichigo didn't hesitate, knowing Zanjitsu would chide him for it if he did. He blinked before saying, "I was considering having my ear pierced. As we all know, Rose loves the sound of his own voice." Here he winked at the blonde, suggesting a joke, even as the man squawked in outraged, with a teasing smile, "And he has preached rumor of your skills." His words brought silence to the room and the orange-haired Shinigami wondered when he began to have that effect. Maybe it was after commanding so many battles, or leading too many war councils. Conversation burst out within a second as the others spoke of Ichigo's sudden declaration. He caught quick flashes of their words, echoing surprise, just as much as the acceptation of the lack of sanity within his head. Love smirked at the quiet uproar Ichigo's question had brought forth, however unknowingly, before he considered the kid's question. The fiery-haired kid was regarding him with those chocolate eyes brimming with determination, the kind he had come to recognize meant Ichigo had his heart set. Nothing, neither heaven nor hell, could stand in his way when those eyes appeared. "Sure, no problem, Ichi. Though we are going to need a needle." Love's answer brought forth more conversation and Shinji, a natural leader among their group, piped up, "Ichi, yeah, sure about this." Before Ichigo could answer, Lisa let out a sigh and placed her novel beside her. Piercing teal eyes centered on Ichigo and her whip-like voice said, "Really, Ichigo? Imagine how Teiko's going to react." Ichigo bristled before blanching at the thought of their captain. Shunsui was unpredictable, even more so than Kaion, but it wasn't like the man would raise that much fuss, right? Shaking away the demurring thoughts that left Shiro giggling, which was never a good sign, Ichigo revealed those eyes burning with determination and silenced any protest that may have leaped forward. With a swivel, Amber Orbs landed on Kisuke, who blanched at the sudden gaze piercing his soul. Really, the man thought he needed some sort of cover, especially in regard to Ichigo. Perhaps a hat would serve his purpose well. That gaze was all-knowing, and Kisuke sighed. The knowledge Ichigo was from a future, however terrible, did nothing to alleviate his disappointment at all his secrets being known. The needle caught the light of the oil lamps and attracted the attention of the other residents, in comparison to Ichigo's triumphant smirk, which remained hidden in the shadows of the cave walls. With a flick the needle was sent sprawling through the air, much to Ichigo's amusement and the incredulity of the others. Hiyori stomped over to whack her stupid captain over the head even as that thin pinprick of metal was caught between Ichigo's fingers. Love rolled his eyes at the rather dramatic display even as Rose nodded in approval. With a flourish of ebony robes, the young Shinigami handed the needle over to his sudden accomplice in crime. Love took the moment to pin Ichigo with one more questioning stare before he slipped from his seat on the futon. Crouching beside Ichigo, Love raised an eyebrow in question. With a silent nod, Ichigo gestured to his right ear. "You know this is gonna hurt, right, Ichi?" Ichigo nodded, a tilt to his lips betraying his amusement. With bated breath, the rest of the vizard waited like an audience for the final act. It was over between one moment and the next with the sharp coolness of an incision accompanied by a pop that seemed like a gunshot near the orange head's ear. The tingling sensation of blood welling up from where the hole in his cartilage was, and left Ichigo pleasantly surprised. "They're done." With that, the abrupt and unanticipated tenseness that had filled the atmosphere dispersed as swiftly as storm clouds beneath the sun. With eyes incredibly bright and a smile small but true, Ichigo looked at Love and said, "Thanks." It was simple but far more meaningful than a long-winded speech, and really Love thought simple honesty suited Ichigo more than whatever crafty games he sometimes played. The young Shinigami with nonchalance rubbed away the blood beating against his ear, and stared at the ruby liquid staining his fingers for a moment. Ichigo paused, staring unseeing at the cave wall. Love recognized that stare, was well familiar with having seen the other scientists of the group wearing it. Within one split second and the next, Ichigo was on his feet once more. He flashed a wink in Love and Rose's direction before he disappeared into the shadows, only the bobbing head of orange like one of the will-o'-the-wisps in the darkness. Ichigo appeared again in a swirl of black fabric lined with white. A gleeful and overly pleased smile like a content cat was settled on his features, and Love, like any sane man, felt slight apprehension at seeing such an expression. Ichigo tumbled down into the mess of fabric, one hand clutched tightly to his torso. He shifted and settled for a moment before stilling. Curiosity struck Love, and with a perched eyebrow he leaned over to glimpse whatever Ichigo was hiding. The orange-haired Shinigami unfurled his fingers slowly to reveal a loop of thin metal that clasped together to form its shape. Connected to the metal was a strange object, pearly white in color. Staring for a time, Love squinted, trying to realize what Ichigo was holding. "It's a hollow tooth." The young Shinigami's words turned some heads even as Love raised his brow in surprise at the nonchalantly spoken words. Sosuke, seated on the other side of Ichigo, regarded the lieutenant pensively for a moment before asking, "How is that possible? Wouldn't the tooth, like the rest of the hollow, dissolve upon its death?" Ichigo smirked softly and shook his head. Reaching up to his now pierced right ear, he unclasped the loop before sliding the thin rod in place and connecting them once more. The picture it presented was oddly fitting, adding a wild feralness that, while already inherent in Ichigo, was now more pronounced. It suited him in a way that raised nostalgia and brought on images of ruggedness that the Shiba clan all seemed to possess. "Oh, that's simple, our masks." A burst of surprise echoed throughout the room at his simple statement as the others considered the implications of his words. Aizen frowned for a moment, tilted his glasses and stared before with a nod. Apparently satisfied, he turned his attention to one of the tomes nearby, and how it appeared there was a mystery. "Do you have a reason for this sudden decision, Ichi?" Rose blurted out with a swish of blonde curls and that melodious voice. Ichigo looked lost for a moment at Rose's question, before with a shrug he answered in a slightly unsure tone, "It was an impulsive idea, and I thought a change would be nice." The vizard sweat dropped at the nonchalant reasoning their youngest member had delivered. It was both unlike the Ichigo they had known and somehow completely expected of the Ichigo they were leaning to see. For the young man presented rather differently to those he was close to than to others. They all had noticed as Ichigo had slowly started to open up and be at ease around them. It was there Love saw the brash decision-making that was never prevalent under the command of Soul Society. He had settled within their group as if they were meant to be together. Fate's hands had been busy in constructing their fate. It was like a puzzle that when apart was far-reaching and altogether near impossible to see the whole picture, but put the pieces together and a new harmony would be found. Ichigo's lips twisted into a faint smile, more genuine than the smiles he plastered onto his features to assure others of his calm state of emotions. That was another difference, Ichigo's emotions. Whether it was the small smiles truer than few he had known, and those soulful eyes. They hadn't been the most defining feature when he first met Ichigo, No, the kid's bright shocking orange hair had taken that pleasure. However, as one came to know the young man, it was easy to see it was the eyes that were far more defining. For the rest of the world, Ichigo displayed a mask. Granted, it was nothing like the famed Kukaki mask of carved stone. No, this merely softened the whirlwind of the orange head's heart so that others would not have to see the contrasting brightness and darkness that danced constantly. Rose tugged on Love's hair, bringing the man's attention away from his musings. Gentle chatter had started once more, and the music, a male quartet that was far too harmonious, jaunted from the turntable. The warm atmosphere that had wavered and wobbled under the face of Ichigo's sudden decision had stilted. Looking over at the source of his thoughts, Love could see Ichigo resting against the cave walls, a curtain of orange locks casting his features in shadow. From a close distance, Love could see that the man was awake and was merely staring contemplatively at the empty space around him. A smile traced his lips, but for a second those amber orbs flashed as dark as moonless night, so full of some deep sorrow, and then it was gone, and Love wondered if he was imagining it. Before any of them could react, a crown of lime green was making itself known. Love thought the lieutenant likely need a bell as to alert the others of their imminent demise as she sauntered towards Ichigo. The orange-haired kid took a breath, more of a sigh, at whatever plan Mashiro had whipped up. She bent at the waist, flashing Ichigo curious amber hues, and in that innocent yet condemning tone asked, "Ichiberry, do you have any other tattoos?" Ichigo blanked for a moment in a slow ascent from where his head had been buried in the clouds. Mashiro's question once again raised silence, and Ichigo held a moment of silence before he responded, "Just one. No, I'm not telling you the story." Mashiro pouted in the childish manner of her nature before, like a joyful sprite, she questioned, "Can you tell us where Ichiberry?" The young Shinigami debated answering her inquisition, before with a nod he pointed to his left thigh. Mashiro giggled, eyes bright, and Love was debating the merit of retreating when Lisa leaned towards them, novel placed beside her and sharp teal eyes gazing out from behind red spectacles. "When did you get another tattoo?" Ichigo blushed suddenly as Yoriyuki's coy golden eyes winked over to the small gathering that had clustered together at the conversation that had ripened into being. The plum-haired captain was likely pondering an intimate relationship between the two, however unlikely it was. The head of the Shinigami Women's Association always had one eye open for the latest gossip. "A few years ago in the summer," Ichigo answered in a slightly questioning tone, only to receive Lisa's frigid stare. A slight frown perched on her lips, but it was one more of long-term suffering rather than annoyance, touched with a hint of fondness. The way one might look at a slightly irritating sibling. "Did ya get it when ya were drunk, Ichi?" Shinji piped up from his little alcove, watching the proceedings with a smirk that seemed to split his features. Ichigo scoffed as if the mere idea of such incredulity was absurd before, in a challenging tone, he responded, "As if, but I'm sure you have more than a few drunken mistakes, Shinji." The blonde squawked as if having taken a particular jab from Hiyori, when in fact the midget lieutenant was rolling on the floor with laughter at the other captain's plight. Lisa was still staring pensively at Ichigo as if trying to recall the sudden appearance of a tattoo on her co-lieutenant. The bone of Ichigo's new piercing caught the oil lamps, and Kisuke jokingly piped up, we should have known all along that Ichi-chan was actually a punk." It was said in that gleeful teasing tone that was both light and slightly spiteful enough to provoke Ichigo. He cast his rather infamous glare at Kisuke before, in a shrug with contemplation on his visage, he commented slyly, "We all have our pasts, no? And if that wasn't a confirmation of some kind, Love would play Rose's guitar." Everyone took Ichigo's teasing words with much the same reaction, startled expressions and wide eyes. Then everyone considered it truly. Because as much as Ichigo presented the image of a stern, hard-working lieutenant, he was loyal to the death, far more foul-mouthed in good company, had a stare to rival Kami, and a certain roughness one saw in the likes of a fighter of the streets. Looking around at the vizard gathered around Ichigo, Love felt amusement rise. Ichigo was like a magnet, and he probably didn't even realize it, drawing people together in one conversation alone so that they were a settled company. The air was warm with the light atmosphere of friendship and the common teasing that took place between everyone. Even Kensei, the normally stone-faced man, was smiling, and Aizen had even set his book down to play part in their light banter. Shinji blanched as Hiyori aimed a rather teasing jab at him, and the two began fighting to the continued amusement of the others. A new song began to play and light conversation began to flow as Mashiro began peppering Lisa and Yoriyuki with questions about their next meeting and the new gossip they would receive. Love settled back beside Rose, his partner, content to continue strumming his blasted instrument with a melodious tilt of his lips. Ichigo was nestled into his little alcove once more, speaking quietly to Kisuke and Aizen with a content smile. Reisu buzzed and swelled with the familiar flow of family, and their souls were far brighter than love has ever thought possible. The air was clouded with dust as Kensei tussled with Rose. The acrid taint of hollow saturating the air as the two dueled with their hollow masks firmly on their features. Ichigo leaned back against his perch of a rocky tower, Kisuke crouched beside him, keen metal gray eyes assessing the battle in front of them. Ichigo was doing the same, only his eyes constantly flicked between their battle and the other wizard monitoring their training as they waited to duel. "We're going back tomorrow, aren't we?" Kisuke spoke softly with a touch of mourning in his voice. Ichigo blinked and peered at the scientist. The man's ghost blonde hair shone like the stars in the afternoon sunlight radiating around them. The scientist's eyes were soft in a way that was usually masked. Ichigo took a moment to think on those words, acknowledging the truth to his words with an inaudible sigh and a strict nod. Shinji, who was sprawled above their heads on the peak of the spire, hung over the edge, blonde hair longer than Ichigo had ever seen in his own timeline, hanging like a curtain of gold. With a nimble turn, the captain flipped over to land firmly on his feet in a crouch. He rose with fluid grace to look at the two before, with an audible sigh, he plopped down beside Kisuke. "I don't wanna." Shinji spoke petulantly, a frown curling upon his lips and casting his features in half-shadows of sorrow. They nodded their agreement, the sentiment shared among them. Ichigo's heart felt heavy in his chest, even as in his inner world the familiar clouds were crowding the horizon. Zanjutsu's deep hum of Reisu swelled beneath his skin and soothed the rush of nerves that bit at his emotions. "Do you think we'll be okay, Ichigo?" Shinji spoke again, a tad more serious, as deep coffee eyes stared into Ichigo's own amber hues. Those words cut him for a moment before the pride that had instated itself in him during the days of their training reemerged from whatever dark covenant. Ichigo ran a hand through orange locks in a common tic he had developed and said, "We'll be fine. You've harmonized with your hollows. The only matter now is training and mastering the techniques. That falls under the broad category of self-improvement. Everything else, well, it will come as it will. We'll just face it head on." If they were surprised by the icy determination hardening Ichigo's voice and sharpening his eyes, they said nothing, only nodding with aching expressions mirroring his own. Slumping against the wall, Ichigo let the strength of his persona fade so that the tired weight that clung to his soul was revealed for a fraction of a second. His thoughts on the matter of returning were complicated in nature. While he missed his family, and he was relatively struggling to admit that, it had taken Shiro beating it into his thick skull for him to accept it, and all the other residents of Soul Society. He knew he would lament the time that he had spent with the wizard, the fond memories and kinship that had budded between the group in the month they had spent together. Idly fingering his new earring, Ichigo smiled fondly, thinking of all the times that occupied their days. From Mashiro's antics that bounced from one thing to the next and sometimes drove them all crazy. Lisa and Love in the corner, sometimes accompanied by Rose reading their pervert magazines. Kisuke and Sosuke hunching over their work tables, only the glim light of a candle illuminating their work of the early morning hours. Hiyori and Shinji bickering with the other and flinging names back and forth. Tessai and Haki dwelling in the kitchen to sometimes explosive results. Working together under the faint sun of the training grounds, tackling, wrestling each other into the earth, and the ring of blades clashing with sparks. The sheen of sweat that would bead their skin and dampen their hair, the empowering rush of hollow Reisu and the accompaniment of the others. But to all the light there was the scale of balance. It ached in some deep part of him to live, breathe, eat, sleep with the dead. They had been close in his timeline, bonded by far more than just battle. Their hollows and the instincts of family that came with it had emboldened their connections. Now they only knew one side of him, not the facet of a man who had seen war and lived, if the afterwards could be called living. It led to sleepless nights like the sun never set behind his eyes, and his inner world was crumbling like the state of his soul. There was also healing to be found. Their presence was soothing, calming the raging fires and towering tsunamis that sprung up a bitter mention of names and times. Even now he found himself thinking of their fates with a simpler ease, thinking of the war with still a laden heart, but one that did not drag him under the earth. To be away from them all for the first real time since he had appeared some 70 years ago gave him a chance to breathe. Now his heart was echoing the familiar dissonant call for his family, the Shiba's antics, Byakuya's calming presence, and the comfort of his mentors. Thinking of them traced a smile onto his lips. Ichi? Kisuk questioned softly, pulling the oranget from his thoughts. He turned to see like expressions on his friends' faces as they watched the duels proceed. Blinking in acknowledgement, Ichigo answered, Kisuk turned to Shinji, who was rolling his eyes at Ichigo's non-committal response before with a nod Kisuk turned back to face him. Those calculating gray eyes stared at him for a moment, assessing all he saw with that lightning-quick mind. Before having silently come to a decision, he opened his mouth to speak. That was when a ball of blonde and black came flying towards them with the speed of a torpedo in water. Shinji stepped forward with a sigh, having pulled himself from the ground far before they had noticed the incoming projectile, and caught the assailant, otherwise known as Hiyori, by the back of her shiksho. The lieutenant hung there like a stuffed puppet, swaying from side to side, arms crossed, and a determined frown gracing her features. Baka Baldi! Hiyori taunted the long-haired captain. With a twitch, Shinji turned annoyed eyes on the blonde, who laughed and untangled herself from Shinji's iron-tight grasp before darting off in a burst of sonito. A laugh stilted from Ichigo's lips, and he watched amused as the two chased each other around the training area. Some things would never change no matter the timeline. Sosuke appeared from around the corner, nose raised from its position in the spine of his latest reading material, to watch the proceedings for a moment. A smile settled on his lips, however faint, and Ichigo heard Shiro's content purr as a similar expression painted Ichigo's features. The brown-haired lieutenant tucked his book into his robes, securing it somehow. Ichigo suspected that the two scientists had sewn multiple pockets into their robes. The idea had merit, and Ichigo was considering asking for their aid. "Yo Sosuke!" Ichigo called out in lieu of a greeting. Brown eyes scanned the scenery before landing on their covered forms. He paced over. Looking to the side and down, Ichigo watched as Kisuk fidgeted with a stray mess of wires and metal, all the while focusing on the approaching figure. Sosuke settled beside Kisuk, and in the quiet lull between the battles, Ichigo could hear the haunting melody of Rose's Shikai, the notes floating on the breeze of power-induced winds. In another habit, he had unknowingly picked up Ichigo fiddled with his piercing, garnering an amused cast of eyes from Sosuke. Turning to Kisuk, he recalled that the man had been attempting to initiate conversation earlier when Hiyori had appeared. Lightly kicking the man's thigh from where the scientist crouched, Ichigo waited for the man to look up. Gray eyes gazed up with a huff, and Ichigo felt the scene was almost wrong without a certain striped bucket hat, but pushed aside the nostalgia and gestured for Kisuk to continue. Kisuk blinked owlishly for a moment before those eyes hardened into two blades of steel, and he asked, "Ichigo, do you have plans?" The orange head stared for a moment before he started laughing, the movement shaking his shoulders and stealing the breath from his lungs. Sosuke looked on in slight worry for Ichigo's sanity as the young lieutenant started to calm himself from the sudden fit of laughter. Eyes cool as the ice residing in the poles, Ichigo caught the attention of the two scientists and replied, "I have plans upon plans. Hardly any of them are masterworks like the two of you are capable of thinking up, but they will work." Kisuk nodded, apparently satisfied, and the silence interrupted only by the ringing of blades. Sosuke, however, pierced Ichigo with those deep brown eyes and asked, "And we will play a part in these plans?" Ichigo shifted slightly so that he was facing Sosuke and Kisuk. He nodded and whispered, "Yeah, you'll see." It was an unsatisfactory answer if the irritation glimmering off Sosuke's frames were any indication, but they could see the honesty in his words and the soul in Ichigo's eyes, so with reluctance they didn't push the matter. "In your future, Ichigo, were the wizard ever like this?" Kisuk phrased the question tenderly, as if wondering whether they could ask such things even when Ichigo had gone over the matter with the two a multitude of times. He would answer their questions as long as they stayed relatively far away from sensitive topics or incriminating information. For example, Sosuke didn't yet need to know the full extent of Aizen's actions. Sighing softly, Ichigo ran a hand through his hair and considered the question for a tense moment before looking at the crystal blue sky filled with puffy clouds above. Ichigo said, "In a way, they had their powers but were bitter and unable to truly connect with their inner hollows. They were still strong and a family, but their bond was different, less vibrant. It didn't flourish and bloom like this. It was cultured through years stuck together with their mutual hate and shared history." Sosuke took the information with a slight somber cast to his Reisu. The control over his emotions that Ichigo had wreaked havoc on was beginning to develop once more, except this time it wasn't so much as wall of stone as a thin veil of cloth. The man underneath the megalomaniac had turned out to possess a sharp sarcastic wit, a faint charisma, and a mind that went beyond madness and into the realm of thought-provoking ideas, often enough to make Ichigo lament the Aizen of his timeline. Kisuk nodded, eyes shadowed by his bangs, and Ichigo thought that made the image a slight bit more fitting. Tilting his head back, Ichigo shoved away the heaviness that was beginning to cling to his heart and head. As much as he could now reminisce with less pain, they still drew on the strength of his soul. The peace of their trinity was disrupted as Shinji barreled into existence beside Ichigo, slumping against the orange-haired lieutenant with a low groan. The blonde was panting lightly with bright, cautious eyes as he gazed warily around the training area, trying to spot the little terror that was Hiri. Having caught no sign of the midget, he continued to lean into Ichigo, first flashing a questioning gaze at Amber Orbs. When Ichigo had nodded, he had proceeded to let out a sigh and settled against the younger Shinigami. They settled there for a time, watching as the sky began to paint itself in sweet hues of gold and orange, fading to a soft hue of pink. Love and Rose appeared first. Dragging an irritated Hiri behind them, they deposited the blonde at Shinji and Ichigo's feet before plopping on the ground a short distance away. Ichigo heard Mashiro's loud, bubbly and childish voice before he saw the young women dragging Kensei towards the group, much to the man's annoyance. A prickle of Reisu like a teasing tail brushed against his senses, and the vague pop of Shunpo resounded before Yoriuki dropped down to curl around Kisuk. Tessai and Haki emerged from the caves carrying plates of food, much to the surprise of the others, that and the other plates floating on a bed of Reisu. The food was set down in the middle of the semicircle they had formed. Before Ichigo could defend against her attack, Lisa had appeared and proceeded to mush Ichigo's hair into more of a bird's nest than it already was before she settled down beside Rose. Shinji pulled himself from his resting place at Ichigo's side to regard the group of Shinigami, instantly catching their attention. He smirked that smile that stretched his lips and said, "Tomorrow's our last day, y'all have done well." The others let out sad hums at the news of their last days, gathered together before similar smiles twitched their features at Shinji's rough praise. Shrugging back the emotions that were suddenly clouding his throat, Ichigo spoke, "You all have done amazing and should be proud of yourselves. Don't worry about the future, it will come as it will. Worry only about how much you're going to improve before you come and battle me. Keep in mind always what has happened here, but also consider that this information and times are between us only. Remember, we're family now, and in the end, we're not formed of blood or water." Kisuk smirked at Ichigo's play on words, as well as the honest pride shining in the orange-head's eyes, the faint but true smile more than enough proof of Ichigo's soul. As they began to eat, sending many thanks to the cooks over the pleasant chatter of dinner, Kensei's chastising voice rose among the common tongue, chastising Mashiro before her voice too was heard. "Let's have a huge bonfire and make the world go boom," Mashiro suggested, dizzily, eyes happy and bright as she tugged on Kensei's robes, pulling the stern man's attention to the rest of the group. Ichigo and Shinji conversed inaudibly over the merit of the idea before, with a nod, Mashiro broke out into cheers. "We should celebrate tonight. If we had sake, it would be all the better." Ichigo was fractionally surprised to hear those words from Kensei, especially supporting one of Mashiro's ideas, but shrugged and accepted them even as Shinji flashed everyone a promising smirk. The man turned, walked towards the stone pillar. He tilted his head for a moment before, with a crouch and flash of the light, he reappeared with a sake bottle in his hands and a collection of cups riding the crown of his head. A collective chorus of happiness rose among the group as the alcohol was poured. Tessai appeared a few minutes later, a smile slipping onto his usually stone-like features under his shades. With a flick of Reisu, a fire began, the food continued to be devoured, and the sake was passed along, seemingly never-ending. Ichigo smiled, resting his back against the rocky spire. Tonight would be a wild time under the moon's careful watch. Tipping back the cup of sake, Ichigo watched as Mashiro corralled Lisa into dancing with her as Rose provided a light and airy tune. The aura of good, whether it be the happiness, food, entertainment, wind, or whatever else saturated the area around them, was abuzz, and Ichigo thought it was a perfect way to end their training. Sosuke flashed a bright smile in Ichigo's direction, and Zanjitsu purred firmly, content with their situation, and the moon rose to her heavenly position in the sky. X. Chapter 23, Naz. X. Kukeku hesitated before the doorway, a pensive frown splayed across her features and her gaze resting heavy on the wooden frame. She could sense his Reisu pulsing and humming in that particular way. She might not have become a Shinigami, but any day she would be able to identify the presence of her family. Ichigo was waiting on the other side of the door, and it stroked a chord of emotions that swirled tempestuously inside her, kindling a burning fury, and releasing a dam of relief that her baby brother was all right. They had been sick with worry when the news of the incident came in, Kyan with sorrowed eyes, heavy brow, and the solemnness that always accompanied death. Captains and lieutenants had been lost, but not in the traditional way. They had received a statement from the Suteiko declaring that the Shinigami who had been hollowified, as the term was, would return. He had given no time frame and stated no names. Granted, the proof was there in the crippling of their ranks. But she had read the reports and they mentioned nothing of a certain orange-haired individual. What they did instigate was the cause, however subtle, and Kukeko was a noble. She wasn't blind to the print between the lines. Which was likely the reason that when she next saw Kisuke and Aizen they would be receiving her wrath and fury. First though was Ichigo. She was worried about the kid. He hadn't contacted them, left them hanging by a thread, gnawing at it with worry. She knew now that he was different, wasn't one of the scientists that had tagged along to experiment and further their training or whatever hogwash the report spouted, because as much as Ichigo hid a brain behind those amber orbs, he wasn't one for socializing. She was fine with whatever Ichigo was now, because he would always remain the same soul-eyed kid she had met in the guest room. All patched up and so very broken, but even then, determined. His Reisu, which now pulsed with a certain feralness and the acidic tang of hollow, shifted restless for a moment before it seemed to take a breath in, and with one moment and the next the door to the Shiba family home slowly slid open. It was a tantalizingly painful few seconds in which Kukeko's nerves racked her gut and mind before her little brother was revealed. When the figurative dust cleared and he was standing in front of her with eyes cast towards the ground, she took in his appearance, like the men of the desert took in an oasis. Sensing her kindling gaze, Ichigo slowly looked up, hesitance in every specter of his movement, but he resolutely held her gaze. Ichigo looked weary. It was the easiest word to describe the soul in front of her when such a myriad of things registered upon her mind. Amber eyes seemed to be swimming in a sea of purple, as the bags under his eyes contrasted sharply against the weak pallor of his face, and the vibrant orange bangs that cast long shadows. The eyes themselves seemed yin and yang, two forces so contrasting always interlocked together. There was a deep tiredness and ache that spoke of sorrow and loss, the kind that wasn't at all fresh, rather the one that's been there for a very long time. Then there was the content, the seeming joy at being reunited with his family that sprung forth like a fountain the moment Ichigo truly set eyes on his older sister. There was some paler shades of it, and Kukeko blithely thought that perhaps his absence was not all bad. She let her gaze fall away from his eyes to take in that hair that gathered around his neck, always so eye-catching, and paused as a thin glimmer of metal seemed to catch the light. Hesitating to scrutinize this sudden sight, she could almost taste the wave of apprehension and nervousness that rebounded along Ichigo's Reisu as Kukeko reached up and pushed aside tangled tangerine locks. Ichigo was truly a punk, she thought with a somewhat amused smirk, even while the rest of her was claiming that the brat was in deep trouble. He had always been rebellious. Oh, he hid it well under the persona of a hard-working lieutenant, but the kid craved chaos and it seemed to follow him wherever he went. There was a certain feralness that had only now become so apparent when Kukeko looked at Ichigo. She thought it might be in part to the Reisu swelling full of instincts and crimson inside her baby brother's soul. But another part of her said that the Ichigo they'd known for so long possessed many masks, and the air of refined grace that the nobles presented like gods was far too easy an example. Blinking, Kukeko thought of a younger Ichigo, one without the shadows and amber orbs. She could see such a rebellious, determined smirk curled on those lips and wondered where it had been for so long. Kukeko took a moment to admire the piercing and the earring hanging in a simple loop with an almost iridescent white tooth dangling from the wire. Leaning back, she assessed Ichigo once more. He looked older now as well, but the piercing seemed to tip that assumption in favor of the kid's apparent inherent punk. It suited him, she thought privately, suited this Ichigo who was already fractionally more open and less like the stone wall he had presented when they first met. Taking a breath before the Shiba princess began her diatribe, she thought that it was good to have Ichigo home. Some unsettled part of her calmed like the tranquil waters that Kaien would stare at for hours when meditating. Then the Shiba princess was off and she spared only a shred of pity for the sudden victim of her fury. Ichigo Shiba, she started off deceptively quiet and watched pleased as the man swathed in ebony flinched before she pounced like the venomous viper. Why couldn't you have even sent us a message? We were all worried sick about you. I mean seriously, a month, no contact, no word, only the report. And a piercing. What will the elders think? Don't give me that stare. I know we all care jack shit about the geezers, but that doesn't excuse the piercing no matter how well it suits you. Ichigo gave her a slightly reproachful gaze before the soft eyes came out. The ones that can guilt you into most anything and seemed a unique talent of younger siblings. Feeling the anger drain from her form in a tired sigh, Kukeiko swept forward and pulled the young Shinigami to her chest, much to his struggle. Ichigo continued to writhe in her arms for a minute, breathing a quiet and erratic rhythm, amber eyes wide. Then his Reisu purred throughout him, the sensation scattering and dancing like wispy boughs of thread over skin. Kukeiko smiled, knowing her younger brother was home, just as his own soul knew. They stayed there for a quiet moment, the evening light of the oil lamps glimmering off skin making it appear golden. The air held their breath and stilted their thoughts so that all Kukeiko could feel and see was Ichigo. Pulling back slightly, Kukeiko tenderly swept a stray strand of orange away from Ichigo's eyes so she could peer closely into their fathomless depths. "I'm sorry, Kukeiko," he whispered quietly and solemnly, the first words he's spoken since he came home. They were so filled with truth and honesty that Kukeiko wanted to bash the kid's head in for making her eyes water. Placing a chaste kiss on his brow, Kukeiko pulled back and absent-mindedly rubbed at the tears collecting in her eyes. "Damn brat, just don't do it again or I will bring out the frying pan." Kukeiko bit out fondly, eyes glimmering. Ichigo laughed, and the heavy weight of the moment disappeared in a flurry of Reisu that playfully chased their forms. It was kind-hearted like the tender saplings of the forest, and so inherently Ganja that Kukeiko only shook her head and flashed Ichigo a promising smile. The young Shinigami tilted his head like a lost puppy in confusion before a smile as bright as the sun but so small it was barely noticeable settled on his lips, and Kukeiko felt that inner warmth of family radiate from her core. "Ichi-ni-I." A blur of green and black appeared following the call, and Ganja was suddenly wrapped around Ichigo. The orange head's eyes were wide in surprise, and instinctively his hands wrapped around Ganja's smaller form, cradling the youngest Shiba to his chest. Shaking away the dazed look, Ichigo looked down into Ganja's wide gray eyes and released a hand to ruffle feathered ebony locks. Laughter trickled from Ganja's lips, brightening up the room all the more while Ichigo smirked before hefting the kid up and swinging him around in a small circle. When Ichigo finally set Ganja on the ground, the two were breathless with laughter and bright smiles were settled on their lips. Ichigo's eyes were tender and so full of light in a way that they only shone with youthful souls. He seemed 1,000 years younger, as if he wasn't a veteran of Soul Society in some war unknown, just a kid with too much heart and far too many enemies in a cruel world. Kukeiko smiled fondly at the scene as the two settled on the ground, Ganja curled up in Ichigo's lap like a cat. "Ichi-ni-I, why were you gone so long? I really missed you." Ichigo winced and a guilty look painted his features. He was quiet for a moment, and Ganja stared at his older brother in worry, not expecting the silence from Ichigo, who always had a response. Kukeiko turned so that she could hear Ichigo's answer, watching keenly the rush of emotions that flicked across carved features. "Some friends and I had to go away so we could train, because there was an accident and we wanted you all to be safe." Ichigo spoke slowly and sincerely, amber orbs staring into Ganja's own. Ganja nodded, wide eyes understanding and bright, as Ichigo wrapped an arm around the kid's waist and lifted the two to their feet with a quiet sigh. "Ganja, why don't you go and grab Kyanenii and his Hinji?" Kukeiko asked, knowing that Ichigo could use the time to acclimatize to being home once more, and additionally that any Shiba could be a bit overwhelming, especially as children. Ganja nodded, a determined look twisting his lips before he sped off, flashing one more beaming smile at Ichigo with a little wave. Ichigo responded with a small wave, chocolate eyes bright and a fond smile curling his lips before he turned to Kukeiko and nodded his thanks. The Shiba princess chuckled and wrapped an arm around Ichigo's shoulders. She barely caught it in the fleeting and flickering light of the oil lamps, but darkness as deep as the oceans surrounding Japan and beyond covered Ichigo's eyes. She wondered if it was because of his Hein. Because that same look had sometimes haunted his eyes before. She remembered well the first time Ichigo had been dragged into having dinner with his Hein, when it was just them. He had been a wraith of himself throughout the night, mind somewhere distant, and heart shuddering in his chest. Kyan had been beyond concerned about the reason and had met Kukeiko in the early hours of the morning. Kyan had wondered if it was because his Hein might have reminded the orange head of his own father. He had recalled with some fondness one of their Sake sessions, as her enigmatic brother had dubbed it. Ichigo sometimes shared things then in the quiet cover of night where it was just them and the silence that would never speak. But that darkness had faded slightly the next day, and more so as time went on and his Hein interacted all the more with the semi-estranged orange head. Why now was that darkness so passionate, she wondered. Shoveling away the pensiveness that was filling her mind, Kukeiko smiled and guided the young Shinigami out of the entryway and further into the Shiba household. They settled in one of the sitting rooms where the others could easily find them. It was covered in a swath of deep blue silks embroidered with metallic detailing, plush cushions that cluttered together endlessly, and oil lamps with mosaic-like pieces of glass that made the room glow. It was one of Ichigo's favorite rooms, and many times Kukeiku stumbled upon the kid curled up with a book and shrouded in silks and looking for the life of her like a piece of the room. Ichigo fell back onto a gathering of pillows with a heavy sigh followed by a quiet moan. Flicking her eyes over in surprise as Kukeiku settled into the swaths of fabric, an amused smile played her lips as she glimpsed Ichigo. In complete careless disregard to nobility and presenting a poised facade, Ichigo was sprawled across the pillows horizontally. His gaze was focused on the ceiling before it swung to rest on Kukeiku at the light laughter that fell from her lips. He looked like a fallen angel, bright flame hair sprawled around the crown of his head like a halo and pale skin shimmering radiantly. There was no reason to wonder why he was one of the most sought-after men in Soul Society. "What are you moaning about, Ichi?" Kukeiku questioned innocently, watching as the orange head shifted slightly so that he could raise himself up onto his forearms and gaze at Kukeiku. Ichigo let out a small sigh and ran a hand through tangled orange locks in his familiar tic before responding, "Just a lot of training, and not enough sleep." Kukeiku nodded sympathetically even as a frown began to form. She was really itching to knock some sense into those scientists' heads. Because her kid brother shouldn't look so tired, but here he was and there was nothing much she could do about the past, but she would damn sure make it that Ichigo could get some rest. "How was the training, little brother?" Kukeiku questioned, that famous insatiable Shiba curiosity sparking beneath her brow. Ichigo's amber eyes flicked towards Kukeiku slowly, absent-mindedly before he tilted his face towards the ceiling once more and replied, "It was long but good. I think we'll be seeing a lot of change in Soul Society." Ichigo spoke quietly in the comforting aura of warmth that surrounded them. Kukeiku quirked a brow at Ichigo's answer, wondering what change the Shinigami meant, but resolved that in the end she would see soon enough. Pushing back an errant strand of ebony, Kukeiku curled her arms beneath her chest and leaned back so that she could gaze at the same ceiling as Ichigo, wondering if they both were gazing at the same image. The tranquil silence was interrupted by the rebounding sound of feet pounding along the floor, before the sliding door was flung open and a familiar blob of green and black reappeared and attacked Ichigo. The orange head let out a huff as the breath was knocked from his lungs by the flying projectile that was the youngest Shiba. Kukeiku laughed at the helpless look that settled on Ichigo's face, and the deep rubel of his hind's laughter joined her own. Letting her eyes swivel from the rather amusing sight the two youngest Shibas were presenting, Kukeiku's eyes alighted on the doorway. Ishine was there, broad frame seeming to fill the space, and that goofy grin settled firmly on his features. Kion was behind him, sea gray eyes warm and alight at the sight of Ichigo and Ganju playing together, and Kukeiku was beyond happy that her eldest brother was out of his funk. The Shiba men could be so melodramatic. Her elder brother had been moping and depressed the whole month, as if Ichigo had died rather than gone away. As much as the man presented the usual Shiba antics, Kukeiku also knew her brother man was genuinely worried about Ichigo and had greatly missed their younger brother. Ishine strode in with that confident swagger and settled beside Kukeiku, content to wait for a better time to greet Ichigo. Kion on the other hand rushed in and decided to add to the growing dogpile of limbs on the floor. Absently, Ichigo's groan of displeasure and subsequent squawking echoed throughout the room, accompanied by Kion's usual prattle of words that followed whatever cruel rebuttal Ichigo had delivered. Turning to Ishine, Kukeiku offered the clan head a soft smile, noting the man's chocolate eyes watching the scene with tender fondness. The kind that only appeared around his family, and even then, rarely. The head of the clan was through and through an enigmatic man-child. Laughter suddenly burst into existence, drawing Kukeiku's attention. Her eyes flicked back to the group of boys to watch as Kion and Ganju double-teamed Ichigo, nimble hands roving over the orangette's chest and eliciting the light bubbly laughter that Ichigo so often hid. Kukeiku almost forgot how Ichigo's laughter sounded, but when she heard it she couldn't help but smile. Those two, when they teamed up, were one of the few occasions in which Ichigo could be elicited to laugh. In a sudden turn of the tables, Ganju was the one under merciless hands, and the bright airy laughter of his youth bounced across the air as his two older brothers attacked. The three settled down. Kion and Ichigo flopped back against the gathered pillows, Ganju tucked in between them and the air free with their happiness. "Welcome home, Ichi," Kion chirped, rolling over slightly so he could gaze into deep amber orbs. Kukeiku smiled and echoed the sentiment, watching those amber orbs glow for a moment before the flame fell to a simmer. Ichigo pushed himself up so that he was in a sitting position, his back against the wall as was customary for how he liked to sit, and didn't that say something about instinct and strategy? Kyan remained flopped on the ground, sea gray eyes connecting with Ichigo's while Ganju pillowed his head on Ichigo's lap. Ishine coughed as if trying to draw the attention to himself, which was all too likely, and Ichigo's head swiveled in Ishine's eye's direction, soon followed by the others. A flurry of emotions passed through Ichigo's eyes, feather-light and fleeting like shadows, before like always they were tamed beneath the soulful amber. "Hey Ishine." Ichigo spoke nonchalantly, knowing it would likely strike a reaction from the clan head. A teasing smile rested on the orange head's lips, and Kukeiko could see that mischievousness that he always hid in the curve of his features. Ishine began frowning for a moment before with a wink he turned to Kukeiko and dramatically flung his arms over her shoulders, pretending to sob all the while wailing, "Oh Kami. My nephew hasn't seen me for a month and all I get is a hey." Kyan looked like he was considering joining in on the dramatics, face lit up in that silly Shiba way before he decided against it with a quick sweep of Ichigo's face, as if trying to memorize every detail that had been absent for the past month. Ishine continued to whine in the background, and Kukeiko let out a soft sigh as the man continued to blubber on her shoulder. Before the Shiba princess could whip out her favored frying pan, Ichigo called out, "Oi old man. Stop whining all over Kukeiko-ne." That was different, she thought with a bit of surprise. Usually Ichigo didn't resort to calling out Ishine. Normally Ichi would just ignore the man's crying and leave whoever was the unfortunate victim to their own devices. Then again, Ichigo was different, at least since last they saw him. Granted, they were minor differences in one's eye, but in the grand scheme of things Kukeiko saw that it accumulated. Ichigo seemed more comfortable in his own skin, and moreover he was much happier and open. Oh, he was still that kid who wanted to hide away from the world, but perhaps a little less now. She wondered if before whatever trials had befallen him, in the time before they met, if he had been like this. Kukeiko hoped so, because it meant the kid was healing. It led her to think of the reasons for this new healing, and maybe it was the release of the truth regarding his powers, maybe it was the time away from Soul Society with a small group of people he could call his own. Kukeiko didn't know for certain, but she was thankful nonetheless. Ishine paused for a moment before, like a cloud of darkness had formed over the man's head, the clan head was silent as death. Then the whispers under his breath started, and the man began to move in whimsical ways, eliciting laughter from the gathered members of the family. Ganju rose from his perch on Ichigo's lap, tugged at the long strands of orange hair before he sauntered over and landed on Ishine's lap. Those innocent wide gray eyes flashed up towards Ishine in the crippling and debilitating stare that Ichigo and Ganju had down to a T. The stare that could bring down a nation and make one surrender their heart. With a fond sigh, Ishine re-emerged from his cloud of depression and ruffled Ganju's ebony locks. Kyan, in a flurry of uncoordinated movement, which is how it always was with her older brother Zanjutsu excluded, came to rest beside Ichigo, the two twin-like in appearance leaning on each other. Ichigo presented an irritated front with his trademark frown for a minute before, with a simple shake of his head that sent orange cascading like fire, the expression slipped away, replaced with warm calm. "So Ichi, what was training like? Did anything naughty happen?" Kyan piped up beside Ichigo, loud enough so that everyone was drawn into the conversation. Ichigo ruffled like a bird, eyes prickling like lightning. He turned to Kyan as if to vehemently deny such claims before a smirk curled his lips. It was a smile that carved one's features and reminded her of a certain blonde with far too much hair. "The last night was interesting, Kyan." He ended that simple statement with a wink and a slight tinge of rose dusting his cheeks. Kyan stared for a moment dumbstruck, eyes wide and uncomprehending, before a blush dusted the ebony-haired lieutenant's cheeks and he squawked, "My baby brother has entered the world of manhood." It wasn't a moment before Ishine, with a jovial and ill-forbidding smile for Ichigo, joined in. They were like a choir of screeching cats, and Ichigo sighed, rubbing a hand over his eyes before a glimmer of mischief entranced amber orbs, though the same light of honesty remained, and Ichigo spoke above the rambunctious din. "Kyan, Ishine, I haven't been innocent in that way for a long time." Kukeiko debated, covering Ganju's ears as the kid gazed on in confusion, lost on what the adults were discussing. Ichigo flashed her an assuring wink even as the two men fell dramatically to the floor as if stuck by supernatural force. Short laughter escaped Kukeiko's lips, and Ichigo joined her, accompanied by Ganju, who though lost was caught in the contagious laughter. As they all settled into a silence once more, the question that Kyan had phrased entered their minds once more, and curious eyes stretched towards Ichigo, and the man ran his hand through bright orange locks before he asked, "How much do you guys know?" Kukeiko thought about the young Shiba's question. She had read the reports, and they really needed to work on a report writing class at the academy because that was plain chicken scratch, however unclear as they were usually presented. It had stated that the Shinigami who had disappeared in one night, leaving a flurry of commotion and turmoil in their wake, had been hollow-fied. The news had reached them the next day that Ichigo had been seen in the first division, storm on his brow and fire in his heart. Together Ichigo and the Suteiko had entered the chamber of the Central 46. But those were only rumors, and she lamented Ichigo's time if he had to deal with the senile old fools. The report continued to speak of the disappearance, in addition to the Shinigami sent on the mission, of Lieutenant Aizen, Kisukura Hara, and the captain of the Kido Corps. Yuriuki had appeared like a cat drowned in water the third day in, plum locks frayed and golden eyes edging on feral touched with worry. Kukeiku had comforted her longtime friend even as her own thoughts had turned to her younger brother because no one had seen him for 3 days and he hadn't been sent on the mission. After the report came out, Kyan had marched towards Shunsui Teiko's office. Kukeiku heard that he had been the epitomize of calm lethality, like the still lake waiting to erupt forth with the power of a tsunami. The Shiba lieutenant had entered the 8th, dim and clouded with a somber air and the scent of sake as the captain lamented his 2 lost lieutenants. Kyan had pushed Shunsui against a wall, eyes blazing and voice low, had questioned the man how Ichigo, who hadn't been assigned to the mission, could be missing. Yuriuki had remarked it was only Jushiro Teiko's intervention that calmed Kyan down, because as much as Kyan cared about the genial white-haired captain, family would always come first for Kyan and he wouldn't hesitate to kill for them. The same could easily be said for Ichigo. It made up the core of the Shibas and that of the orange-haired Shinigami's being and was reflected in that deadly cleaver of sunlight. The report had detailed the names and yet Ichigo's was not there. The curiosity had plagued them just as grief haunted others. Kyan had slumped in his office that night and drained a bottle of sake, eyes dark as a ravine. The simple paper merely stated that they would be trained for a month in how to manage these newly given powers. It had barely covered the concept of hollowification, stating only that the victimized Shinigami now possessed the capabilities of hollows. Coming back from the blanket of her thoughts at the heaviness that invaded the room, she realized Kyan had briefly covered the report. The darkness in his eyes had returned and it reflected in kind within Ichigo's own eyes. Ganja looked up at his high and concerned brow furrowed in a slightly petulant curl of his lips. Kukeiku shook her head in slight amusement at her little brother's antics and beckoned the youngest Shiba towards her even as Ichigo spoke. To have an inner hollow is to have all you fear, hate, anger, everything dark about you personified with golden eyes. You want to fight that, push it away and lock that darkness up so you don't have to face it. But that isn't cohesive, it torments your soul and rips it apart without you knowing it. The only way to become stronger truly, is to find harmony. Hollows are creatures of instincts, and if you defeat them in battle with the intent of partnership you can achieve such. That was what we started with. Forming the bond between the beings of one's soul. What can be difficult is that in the process it is the Zanpakuto spirit that is hollow-fied. It can be like trying to find that bond from the beginning, all the while a thin thread of the former union hangs in the balance. Once we achieved that, we moved to the actual training of using the hollow techniques we were gifted with. Because in the higher echelon of hollows there are techniques alike to those Shinigami posses and some belonging only to the residents of Hueco Mundo. Ichigo spoke softly and earnestly, his voice one that told of experience yet echoed some hidden uncertainty. In the candlelight, his eyes flicked golden and Kukeiku felt shivers trace her spine even as her soul echoed her confidence in Ichigo. Ganju shifted slightly in Kukeiku's lap and Ichigo sent a small assuring smile in the boy's direction before with a quiet sigh he slumped, resting his head against Kyan's shoulder. Ishine and Kyan were silent. Of the occupants of the room they were the ones who understood Ichigo's situation and his words the most. For they were Shinigami, the opposites of hollows and balancers of their world. Sometimes she lamented her family's role within soul society, knowing that they could lose their lives for the role they fought. It was Kyan who broke the silence, refraining from turning to face Ichigo and disrupting the younger Shinigami where he rested, eyes at half-mast with gentle breaths escaping parted lips. Ichi, can you demonstrate anything? One amber eye opened fully to gaze up at Kyan with partial loathing and the question why. Ganju perked up, eyes bright, and Ichigo with a frown at Kyan heaved himself to his feet, swaying for a minute before gaining his balance. For a pensive moment Ichigo stood there debating what to show them before Reisu began to gather. It snaked along his arm, crawling along his features in arcs of crimson and ebony. With slow drawn-out movements Ichigo dragged his hand over his features. The last Kukeko saw of his eyes held hesitance and weariness, a certain fear lingering like the last dredges of night. Bone-white and inherently terrifying, Kukeko wanted to recoil at the mask decorating her baby brother's features. It was cold and primal, with sharp black lines and spiked teeth. Through the eyes sockets gold-framed in black peered out. Kukeko's gaze was drawn towards Ganju, expecting the youngest to be displaying the irrational fear that was bubbling underneath Kukeko's skin. Instead, the kid struggled from her arms, flashed her a cocky smirk and bounded over to Ichigo. Orange locks like a river rippled as Ichigo tilted his face hidden by the mask down to look at Ganju. The ebony-haired child pointed at the mask, eyes pleading. Laughter faint with echoes of a dual tone rippled around the room, seeming fated as Ichigo gingerly removed the mask from his features and dropped it into Ganju's eager hands. Kukeko wanted to protest the action even as gold enshrouded by black sclera swept around the room, connecting with her eyes and assuring her of Ganju's safety. Her fears were settled as she saw those eyes. Because even behind that burnt caramel color there was Ichigo. His soul and heart couldn't be hidden by a mask, and she felt ashamed of the fear that had swept her away. Ganju's laughter dripped from the air as he placed the too large mask over his own features, and Ichigo jokingly stated, "Far more terrifying than I could ever be, kiddo." Here he flashed his eyes towards the adults in the room and continued, "Though it's normal to feel a bit of fear, that's just Shiro's nature." His eyes, though Ichigo's, held a distance as if he was preparing himself for an impact they couldn't see. There was a raw old pain throbbing there like a vein of melted gold, and Kukeko wanted to comfort her little brother, assure him of whatever fears chased his heart. But she couldn't, because her own doubts and fears, however quelled by Ichigo's soul, still reared its ugly head in her direction, a frothing, hissing mess of confusion. At the silence that greeted Ichigo's statement, the darkness lingering became keener in a way that was all too much like a black hole, sucking into it the light around them and quenching all thoughts of escape. Isshinji was silent and cold, the expression on his face as blank as stone and possessing nothing except for the amber hue of his eyes. Kion appeared the same, though as always, the lieutenant was different from the clan head. Sea green eyes bubbling with concern were heavy with thought and indecision. It was the look her brother donned when he warred with some part of himself, whether that be Nijibana or his own moral dilemmas. As that dreadful silence began to choke the life from the room, Kukeko wanted to yell at the two Shinigami to do something, as she felt helpless as if watching the scene from far away. Ichigo was drowning in a wave of hurt. She could taste it in his Reisu, heavy on the air with the acrid taint of hollow and ash. Isshin was the first to move like an automated man springing to life for the first time. With disjointed movements he stepped forward, drawing the attention of the occupants of the room. Decision made, serious fire blew as the darkest embers haunted Isshinji's eyes, and the captain swept forward to embrace his young nephew, wrapping him up in that bone-crushing, soul-assuring hug. Ichigo let out a shocked gasp of air at the tight arms encircling his waist. Fear and panic and the other 100 emotions that would cascade over carved features when contact was thrust upon the orange-haired Shinigami, flashing like lightning. Then Isshin's warm Reisu like summer heat, or the burning sensation of a hot drink traveling through your core, enveloped the duo, locked in a tight embrace. Ichigo deflated, muscles falling limp, his eyes, once two dark bubbles of emptiness, were vibrating with a tender and fragile hope. "Ichi, we will always accept you, we're family." Those assuring words, whispered yet still carrying, sent pangs through Kukeko's heart. She watched as at those words the ebony sclera fled and Ichigo was in strong corroded arms, understanding this acceptance with a watery smile. They remained in that tight embrace for another minute, where Ichigo's eyes were distant and nostalgic, grasping onto some familiar shred, before that faulty smile curled his lips and he pushed away from Isshinji with a huff. Kion laughed and stalked over, slinging an arm around his brother's shoulder. His other hand reached up to ruffle orange strands while the lieutenant leaned in to whisper something in Ichigo's ears. The atmosphere that had hung like a coming storm dispersed, and the calming lull of Kion's Reisu hummed throughout the room. Ganju peeked out from under Ichigo's other arm, a childish smile curled on his lips and eyes bright. With a laugh, the three brothers began to toss and tumble around the floor, the mask that had been clasped in Ganju's hands hidden from existence. Isshin smiled bright and assured that his nephew was no longer in that danger his own soul always submerged him in. With a holler of glee fitting the man-child, he joined the growing pile of limbs flaying like a rolling mess of seaweed. Kukeko laughed at the humorous sight, raising a hand to cover her mouth as light sparkled in the air. "Kukeko, join us," Ganju called out as he rolled out from under the tangle of limbs, breath leaving his lungs in heavy pants and a beaming smile stretching across his lips. Kukeiko laughed at the kid's demand, knowing that entering that mess was tantamount to an apocalypse, so she only shook her head and shushed the kid to keep playing with a small flick of her hand. Kyan slipped out from beneath the mass of bodies between one moment and the next, just as Ichigo's laughter burst from his lungs from his position crushed beneath the clan head and Ganju's nimble fingers. That stupid Shiba grin was settled on Kyan's face, and he settled beside Kukeiko with a sigh, tipping his head back as he continued to gulp and heaving grasps of air like a man without water. His hand, calloused from hours spent wielding Nejibana's worn hilt, curled into her own in a silent show and asked for support, tightening her hand reassuringly within his larger one. Kukeiko let her head turn, her own blue eyes staring into the swath of sea that was her brother's eyes. Tomorrow he returns, they all return. I wonder if it's going to be the catastrophe that the weather seems to instill its belief in me. Kyan spoke in that wandering tone, the one that dragged him through the deep blue and was a far cry from the overly jovial Shiba front he usually donned. Kukeiko nodded, the knowledge having lingered throughout her mind, during the return of one of their youngest members. He's happier, was Kukeiko's reply, sage and soft, knowing that she could hardly assure her brother in this matter. Ichigo had already declared that the Suteiko had taken care of it, and who was she to doubt the head of Soul Society or to ask fate of her plans? Kyan turned his attention to the group of boys, because his Hein was hardly a man, fond smile tilting his lips, the expression was mirrored on Kukeiko's own mouth. Yeah, but he's also dead tired. It stings a bit that we weren't able to bring that warmth back, weren't able to heal him. But Kami, it makes my heart sing seeing him like this. I want to thank them, then let Nijibana free for what they dragged my brother into. Kyan replied with melancholy, a hurt in his voice that belayed his will, but it lightened when he spoke of Ichigo before it resounded to a growl. His eyes flashed dark as the stormiest sea, cloudy with flashes of lightning sparking that protective flare and warning danger to any unwary sailor. Kukeiko nodded in agreement, knowing that the fools who caused all the trouble that happened would be receiving a mixture of responses. Tucking a stray strand of ebony out of her eyes, Kukeiko gazed at her older brother for a moment, the future seeming to stretch out before them in that moment where Orange caught flame and his laughter bounced like an echo. I'm damn glad he's home. You can finally tell him about me, Ukko. Kukeiko phrased softly, striving to draw that darkness from her brother's eyes. Because Kyan was terrifying when he wanted to be, and even if her soul knew better, that wouldn't soothe the irrationality of it all. So, she mentioned the women he'd found. She was sweet and kind, but with the determined resistance of iron. Kukeiko thought they'd be a good match, but she wasn't tempted to intervene and would let life decide it. Oi Kyan nii help. Ichi nii is escaping. Ganju called out over his Heinji eyes uproarious laughter. Kyan flashed her a sort of sad smile that was determined underneath the aches and pains that haunted his thoughts before, with a familiar flourish, he bounded up from the mound of cushions. Ichigo's head peeked up along with an arm bursting through, reaching towards a hidden sky. Panicked eyes, though light with the fun, flashed towards Kukeiko pleadingly, but the Shiba princess laughed and in a way totally unhelpful to her younger brother sat there and listened as his Heinji continued to spout some nonsense. His nerves prickled and drove beneath his skin, and Ichigo resisted the urge to shift at the heavy and oppressive Reisu that pinned the vizard where they stood gathered in the meeting room of captains. The Suteiko was directly in front of Ichigo in his position at the end of the two lines, staring into amber orbs without opening his own blazing inferno of pupils. Shinji was on his right and Kisuke on his left, because the scientists aren't always right and Ichigo wanted to make a point, so Suke was hiding somewhere with the others, masking his presence as the spectacle-wearing lieutenant often favored. Ichigo was never normally nervous when it came to facing the Suteiko or even the imposing presence of a united front of captains and lieutenants, but this situation sent sickly nostalgia through him, choking his breath and calm. This reminded him all too much of when he was condemned, reminded him of the solemnness that the next death report would always entail. And it's different when you are standing there for the people you've taught, trained, taken under your metaphorical wings. Their life depended on him without them even knowing it in the beginning, and now maybe it was their pride or the sake of peace that was riveted throughout Soul Society. A ravine stalking throughout the paved ivory streets that all dwelled on the now hollow-eyed members of its sanctious regality. Ichigo knew he would have to speak with the Suteiko at a later time, probably after the meeting adjourned. The old man would want to talk to his protege/grandson/friend or whatever the old man considered Ichigo. Because the orange-haired Shinigami was a noble and Ichigo could be a master of manipulation even of his own feelings in front of others, Ichigo knew that the Suteiko could see how Ichigo struggled to hide such truths from the old man, not when he'd revealed the circumstances of his presence. Then the lieutenant would have to march to his division, and confront his captain. He was relieved that Lisa would see the drunkard first because Ichigo didn't think he could deal with that heated and accusing stare. Oh, it had been lovely coming home the night before, but his older siblings had pinned his form with heavy stares and Ichigo wasn't sure what he was supposed to feel. The guilt had been expected just as Kukeiko's wrath, but it had been Ganju's hurt expression like a kicked puppy, and goddamn didn't his sisters give him the exact same look when he came back from the campaigns during the war, and Kaien's solemnness. Still the warmth of the Shibas had been unparalleled and the Shiba house was nothing but home to him now. The laughter and Shiba antics had settled his fears and wrapped him up in their bubble of family once more. Yet even still his traitorous heart yearned for that freedom again. The ability to wake up at 3 in the morning and wander into the training grounds undisturbed, except for the pesky scientists, and fling Zanjutsu around in a way that released that tense caste to his Reisu. Now he was here in Soul Society again. He both dreaded that and welcomed that. Because there was no routine in that dusty ground, just the camaraderie, the easiness of family. But Soul Society was order, and sometimes he welcomed that. Granted it was more of organized chaos, but it was the thought that counted. It was the press of familiar yet strange Reisu bearing down all around him every moment of every day and he couldn't escape. Sometimes it was comforting, other times it stirred his soul restlessly. The standstill of silence was drawing to a close as Yamamoto thrust his cane upon the ground in that jarring sound that drew everyone's attention. Ceaseless muttering grounded to a halt and everyone waited with bated breath for the head of Soul Society to speak. We welcome the Shinigami Holofied into our ranks once more. They are different, and we cannot change that. We must accept it and learn from it. The man, always one of few words, said only that, opening one crackling eye to consider the members of the chamber one by one. Considering their souls and drawing them to listen and heed his words. The current captain of the 11th scoffed. Ichigo still didn't know his name and hadn't bothered learning it. Zaraki would always be the captain to him even if it took a few years, that familiar bloodlust gleaming in his eyes. Ichigo wanted to sigh or laugh but remained impassive, all too familiar with the 11th Division's tactics or lack thereof. There would be challenges and fights to see the merit of these new powers, but Ichigo thought that fine. Let them show Soul Society their power, their might, and the abilities that have been stowed in them and accepted because of his will. Yuriuaki from her position close to the Suteiko winked at Ichigo and Kisuke, a coy smirk tilting her lips. Ichigo smirked as beside him Kisuke blushed slightly while Ichigo only debated with Shiro the impact that her new information would have within the ranks of the Shinigami Women's Association. The young lieutenant could feel Ashine's eyes on him. They were warm like a fire, and Ichigo, who had experienced the cold of the Reichenbach fortress, wanted to bask in the heat, like he did the sunlight. Instead he pushed back the overwhelming waves of exhaustion that pounded on the borders of his mind. The man's actions yesterday had shocked him to the core, sent lightning flashing throughout his inner world in spirals that descended on the greenery only to enliven it. It had been unexpected but nonetheless important. Because when had he last been held by his father? Even if this man was a far cry from the older man, the sensation was there and overwhelming. He had been drowning in doubt, in fear, in 1,000 other thoughts of rejection, made all the worse by his exhaustion-driven mind. Because this was his family, and what did he have to fight for if not family? Their acceptation had empowered him. It felt like when his Shinigami powers had been revived, though perhaps less soul-consuming. That wound had never healed, and every acceptance was a step in the right direction, or so Zanjutsu Asen would drone with fond eyes hidden behind yellow visors. If no one has anything they would like to voice. The Suteiko began sensing the thoughtfulness that a meeting did not need to host was prevalent, as no one had stepped forward with their input. Shinji coughed, smiled that Cheshire smile, and stepped forward so that he was between the two groups, a figurative bridge. He began. Now I don't expect y'all to understand, or even accept it immediately, but I want ya to recognize a few things. We're all the same people ya knew a month ago, so don't be afraid of us, challenge us, or test us. We aren't afraid of ya either. 3. This redhead over here should have been promoted to captain, cause he's the one we have to thank for our lives. Shinji spoke a touch grandiosely. What was it with geniuses and dramatics, with feral yellow eyes that heightened everyone's attention? Ichigo blushed at the blonde's words when he intoned that Ichigo should be a captain. He did not want that responsibility nor the praise. He was content to remain a shadow hidden in the background of the whole issue. Then Shinji had gone and thrown him under the figurative bus. The blonde with a sway of short blonde strands, because they got up to way too much mischief their final night, shot a smirk over his shoulders directed at Ichigo. A chorus of voices responded to Shinji's declaration, some humored by the captain, because they knew this man and it was exactly like him, and others grumbled but resigned to accept their fate. More than a few pairs of eyes swung towards Ichigo and he wanted to shoulder himself behind Haki but declined that gratuitous idea and remained there. The Vizard's Reisu surged around him muted in the atmosphere of Soul Society but comforting all the same. He let his own Reisu untamed and wild urge from beneath his skin to entangle with theirs. It was funny how they could now sense when discomfort brewed beneath his skin, they were connected like that. The uneasiness of the afternoon passed like a fleeing shadow and Ichigo was glad they were here with him. The Suteiko nodded though he flashed a stare full of sunfire at Shinji before dismissing the captains and lieutenants. That amber eye flashed towards Ichigo and with a slightly weary sigh he turned to Lisa and nodded. The lieutenant flicked her glasses, shot him a glare, and even then, it was accompanied by a fond smile before she was gone with the others. Turning his head to the ceiling shrouded in shadows above, Ichigo allowed himself to imagine the sun shining on his features. He took the moment to bask in all that had happened even if the events were tremulous and the weight of the future before as present as ever. Feeling the heavy gaze of the Suteiko he let out a sigh and paced forward tipping his face to gaze at the old man. A smile unconsciously slipped across Ichigo's lips and he glided forward so that he was in arm's reach of the Suteiko. The bearded man stared impassive for a moment before a smile circled his lips as well and the man reached out to ruffle Ichigo's vibrant locks with a mumbled, "Damn brat." A beaming smile split Ichigo's lips and the two began pacing outside of the regality that the meeting hall imposed and out into the lustrous gardens of the first. The sun was bright and beaming in the spring air. Ichigo felt a fondness for the old man bubble up and realized dully that he had missed the Suteiko, who had become something of a grandfather figure in the time he had known the bearded old man. He hadn't talked to the old man since the first week of their exile when they teamed up to combat the senile members of Central 46, it had been explosive and Ichigo could understand Aizen's like of such situations. It almost made Ichigo lust for his youth. The adrenaline rush and the power that came from standing up to authority incited him. Kami he wanted to do that again, march in and create chaos wherever he went with a smile on his face. But that was his youth, and the world wasn't always kind enough to grant him the fortitude to conduct such ventures. The feeling of nature embossed around him comforted his spirit and he could feel the hum of Zanjitsu Asen's pleasure at the greenery around them. They settled on a stone bench under the eaves of a willow tree that draped around them like a lover's limbs, in a silent comfort born of their many meetings surrounding them. "Are you happy with the results of their training?" Yamamoto asked, eyes peeking from beneath the caterpillar of hair that were his eyebrows. Ichigo nodded, thinking of the days spent under the sun with the dusty air. He trusted them, and trusted in the abilities and character of the Shinigami. They weren't masters of their powers, few of them probably would reach such a level without determination and effort. But they had found balance and harmony, and in change gathered power that would be essential when the Quincy finally came. "Yeah, they're ready," Ichigo responded assuredly, head tilting to glimpse the sun on its slow canter across the sky on its path to midday. He wanted to nap beneath that sun, but of course sleep would have to wait. He meant it, though what they were ready for he wasn't sure. Maybe it was Soul Society, maybe the future. "Are they better than your timeline saw?" Yamamoto questioned with a bob of his head that sent that white beard trailing across a canvas of ebony. Ichigo flinched slightly. Speaking of those times so freely always sent alarm bells ringing and raised the hairs on the back of his neck. Considering the Suteiko's question, Ichigo thought of their power, the duels they had engaged in. It was hard to compare them to his own timeline where the range in their powers was hardly close. But they were strong, almost close to the point where the 1,000-year war began, after the fiasco of 3 years that Aizen had subjected them to. That war had strengthened them, turned their bones to iron, and broken something inside of Ichigo. Their strength is greater than when I first met them in my timeline, and that was after years of training. The Suteiko nodded a somber thread to his Reisu as Ichigo spoke about his past. The lieutenant knew the man carried some guilt or grief towards the young soul for what Ichigo had gone through and seen. Because in his heart the old man knew just as much as Ichigo and Kisuke and all the other proprietors of the war that a child shouldn't have been their savior. Kisuke was mentioning something interesting. Ichigo began cautiously as the thought entered his mind, reluctant to focus on the wizard in his past any longer, shifting slightly so that the sunlight only partially glimpsed his form. The head captain turned slightly and hummed, permitting the young Shinigami to continue. Ichigo thought of the enigmatic scientist with a fond smile, the way his eyes would light up whenever he talked about whatever invention planted itself within his mind. Running a hand through his orange locks, Ichigo said, "The man was mentioning the benefits of expanding ventures into the mundane world. Their technology is a far cry of advance compared to ours. He thinks it would be beneficial to instate a force of Shinigami within the mundane world, and I agree with him." The Suteiko opened one eye and assessed the brave Shinigami sitting beside him. Because Ichigo knew few others would project ideas so freely, that was usually left to Jushiro and Shunsui. The old man was thoughtful and considered Ichigo's proposition. Ichigo waited, slightly impatient, soothed only by listening to Zanjitsu's softer hum that underlain the flow of nature and wrapped around him in the faint trace of an embrace. "What does this idea entail?" Ichigo smiled at the man's interest and continued. Kisuke suggested placing a team of Shinigami, some from the 12th and volunteers from the other divisions, in Araishi dense city. We would choose one located in Japan, as other cultures are unfamiliar to us. The scientist then instigated that the teams sent would interchange and the data could be transferred to and from Soul Society. The man hummed, considering the idea, and Ichigo unconsciously gripped Zanjitsu's pommel resting at his waist. He wanted just as badly as Kisuke for the Shinigami to expand their knowledge by venturing to the human world. They would see not only an expanse in technology, but if the other divisions contributed, the whole of Soul Society could benefit. Anohana could gain immense knowledge from the medical knowledge alone. The thing that struck him most, though, was the thought of change within Soul Society's hierarchy and systems. Ichigo wondered if they saw the sprawling urbanism that was barely beginning in Japan yet had already peaked in other foreign countries, that they wouldn't try to tweak their own realm. Because as much as Soul Society was a blast from the past, quite literally, it represented feudal Japan a little too much. The common souls could benefit immensely from an improved economy or even better choices in this afterlife. It was like the militia that had been instated in Soul Society on Kisuke and Ichigo's recommendations. Already they had seen a drop in the crime rates and a rising number of entries within the Shinigami Academy. The thought also chased his mind restlessly as he was torn over seeing his world change for the better, and watching everything familiar disappear once more. Inherently he knew that they would never forsake the way of the Zanpakuto and hand their souls over to the cool metal of gunpowder and technology. Yet it still dragged snaring hooks into his heart, and it was only Zanjitsu Asen's words that calmed that torrent. The older spirit had smiled that assuring smile that Ichigo rarely saw, the one that also said the spirit already knew the answer. He had laughed that deep baritone and rumbled, "Ichigo, you have already changed Soul Society. It is inevitable, you are a harbinger of change, let it be and see what comes forth." The Suteiko coughed, disturbing Ichigo of his thoughts and musings. He turned to face the old man who was considering him with those burning orbs. His voice, brittle with age but nonetheless powerful, rippled in the space between them, and he said, "We shall see. I will consider this proposition. Soul Society will always remain such, but change in small quantities are not always unwelcome." Ichigo beamed at the man's answer, and seeing that the sky had tipped the crown of blue and settled at its peak, rose to his feet. He still had to brave Shunsui and the rest of Soul Society, and he felt a minuscule portion of that weight and worry slide away at the Suteiko's demeanor. "You still owe me a duel, young one, and don't think I haven't considered Shinji's words," the old man commented, watchful eyes tracing Ichigo's form as the lieutenant took a step forward. Ichigo pivoted to regard the man who had amusement curled like a dragon upon his features. Ichigo laughed and nodded before continuing on his way. He looked forward to the day he could truly challenge the old man, test their blades and wool. The old man also knew there was little chance Ichigo would rise to such a position, much less change division, but it was the teasing thought that mattered. As Ichigo exited the first division, he sighed and shouldered once more the burden that his travels had instilled upon him. The orange-haired Shinigami winced at the thought of Byakuya's reaction when they finally met again, not to mention his captain's own reaction. Grasping Zanjitsu's pommel, Ichigo started forward, eyes determined in the next step of the journey. X. Chapter 24, Ostraneni. X. Ichigo hesitated outside the familiar rice paper door. It seemed hesitation was his main medium these days. Zanjitsu's rumble of agreement sounded like thunder crashing in the background of his inner world, and Ichigo pushed aside the irrelevant feelings. He could sense Shunsui and Lisa in the room in front of him. It was near tantalizing for Ichigo. The cramped office, however much it often constituted his ire, was a home. He had missed his captain, missed the teasing smiles, the heady sake, the lax personality and feel of it all. Just like his presence once gone had left an absence in their ranks during the war. The man had grown to fill the role of a father or mentor to Ichigo. The many days spent dueling or training Ichigo how to use his dual blades had formed a strong bond, cords wrapped irrevocably around Ichigo's heart. Shunsui had been the one to show anger along with Shinji at Ichigo's circumstances, that a kid had to fight their wars, and had to deal with the effects of losing his Zanpakuto for a year alone. In the times when it was quiet and the lull between battles was complacent, he would pull Ichigo aside. Sometimes they would voyage to the division kitchens and trade recipes, moving through mechanical motions to prepare food as they reminisced or discussed the war. Other times under the eaves of Sentinel Elms they would share sake and Shunsui would speak of the past, ask Ichigo about his dreams and what the kid had once wanted. And as was the bond of Shunsui and Jushiro, the white-haired captain was never far behind, or always accompanying on whatever escapade they had embarked on. That one time in Rungokai had been killer. The two were like yin and yang, inseparable, and Ichigo sought comfort from them on more than one occasion. But he would always feel a deeper bond with Shu, because they had spent those summer nights of hazy heat with the ringing of blades, baring their souls to one another. With a sigh of nostalgia and the ache of his circumstances, Ichigo slid open the thin door frame and stepped inside. The pungent smell of alcohol that was always present, so much so that it seemed embedded in the furniture, hit Ichigo like he was walking through a cloud of tear gas, as he walked into the dingy office. Lisa's sharp eyes flicked up from behind the rim of her red-horned glasses. She shot him a glare full of malice from over the lip of one of her many novels. Ichigo knew she didn't really mean such spite, it was just how the lieutenant functioned, because underneath Ichigo could see a spark of fondness even with the chastising hues of blue. Shunsui craned his head up from under the brim of his straw hat, warm chocolate eyes blinking in partial surprise before a gentle smile curled his lips. The man stared at Ichigo like he was one of the paintings the sellers in Rungokai displayed, eyes brimming with warmth assessed him, taking his appearance and health with a nod. Ichigo was unsettled, feeling half-fooled, knowing or maybe expecting rightful anger. Ichigo still possessed that instinctive and rash mindset, the one that led him to charge after Rukia and defy what could amount to a government. Granted, he had tamed it somewhat, seen the negative consequences of rushing headfirst into a battle with enemies possessing unknown skills and powers. It had cost him in the end. It had led to a surplus of wounds and one too many experiences he didn't want to relieve. It almost led some to doubt his will to survive. So, he had meditated. Ichigo had drawn from Zanjutsu Asen's seemingly unending reserves of patience and learned tactics under Kisuke and Aizen's watchful gaze, spoke with Jushiro about how to take that instinctive reaction, and it had been a surprise to learn the calm man had once been like that in their academy days, and turn it elsewhere. He had seen Shunsui's anger because of that rashness, experienced the wrath of the laid-back captain. Ichigo knew it was nothing close to the fury that their enemies faced in battle, but Shunsui had been stern and unyielding with his words in his lecture. War changed them all in the end, but it couldn't change the core of one's being, and it was slightly ironic that the words that threaded his soul into existence dwelled on a lack of hesitance. Ichigo swept his amber eyes around the room, avoiding his captain's eyes for the moment. He observed the lack of cluttered papers. Some of the work he knew had been foisted on the lower seats. Shunsui, no matter how much the man could be lazy, knew when it was necessary to deal with work. That or he had burned them, which seemed the more likely option. Ichigo swung his eyes to connect with Shunsui's, knowing that he could delay it no longer with his complacent musings and reminiscing. Smoldering brown locked onto his own, and their souls were bared like animals clashing. For a little while there, Ichi, I thought Yamji finally got his hands on you. It was a tentative bridge between the two kindled in the tense atmosphere, and Ichigo was desperate to cross it. Wiping away the lingering shreds of hesitation and doubt that roiled in his gut like a serpent, Ichigo wanted to settle into that familiar role. Ichigo wanted to take back, if only temporarily, the normality of working in the office, the gentle hum of paper being filled out and the light tangle of their reisu. Not yet, Captain, though the Suteiko was particularly convincing this afternoon. Ichigo responded gaily, shrugging through his words with a sheepish smile. He glided into the office. Shunsui cracked a brighter smile and tipped that worn hat in greeting ambient reisu, circling Ichigo in playful gales. With a sweep of his calloused fingers through orange locks, Ichigo slid forward so that he could plop himself on the worn couch layered with a variety of colored blankets and pillows assorted like a mountain worn and faded with age. "Ma Ichi-chan," Shunsui voiced with that sweeping baritone of his. Ichigo looked up at Shunsui's words, eyes tracing across the room before landing on the man in the flower-patterned haori. With a nod, Shunsui continued, eyes earnest and bright, "We're glad you're back." Ichigo felt a light blush dust his cheeks at those words, and he pushed it away with a slight scowl marking his features in a trademark defense against showing his emotions. Ichigo composed himself for a moment before his eyes danced around the room and he responded, "Glad to be back, though I could do without Kion and his Hinji," eyes wailing. Lisa smirked and Shunsui guffawed at the statement, both well familiar with the Shiba family antics. Ichigo grinned and settled once more, the Reisu of the atmosphere comforting and echoing its usual sensations. "Captain has agreed to take us out to lunch, to, as he says, catch up, though I doubt that's his sole reason," Lisa said, wit sharp as her tone. She flashed those devil eyes in Shunsui's direction. The captain made to protest Lisa's accusation, but that wicked glare appeared and he slumped in his seat, tamed for the moment. Ichigo thought it would be nice to go out to lunch with his fellow lieutenant and Shunsui. Over the years they worked together, they often set out on such ventures, stopping at whatever restaurant heated their fancy within Rungokai's bustling streets. It would be a good opportunity to escape Siraidi's cloistered air where the walls had ears, and gossip flew like the wind. In a restaurant, they were secreted from the world, and though still members of a government system, they were able to speak with ease and without rank. Often Yuka-take joined them, adding to their little bubble his deep insight and the calm he seemed to walk around with like a cloak, adding to the flowing atmosphere. Sometimes he dragged Kion, in which Ichigo was sure Kion was usually not in the know, along. Then their lunches were all the more energetic as the hyper members of their party detailed whatever daring story was the topic of discussion. Thinking of his brother brought a question to mind and Ichigo asked, "No normal Shibas? I don't think I can deal with more of his blubbering. I think he mentioned the words miss you over 10 times in 1 minute." Shunsui laughed at Ichigo's teasing, knowing that the eldest Shiba sibling would always likely receive such taunting from the orange-haired Shinigami. Lisa muffled her laughter behind her palm, raven tails swinging with the force of her amusement. Shunsui took a sip of the sake cup resting innocently on the desk. Ichigo watched mildly surprised as Lisa ignored the affront to her work standards. "No normal Shibas, as you've so fondly put it, though I think you would be hard-pressed to categorize that clan as anything close to normal. Though Ju might come, he missed my lieutenants as well, after all, who was to fetch me?" Ichigo chuckled at Shunsui's lilting teasing and Lisa shot their captain a knowing stare and shook her head softly. Ichigo sunk into the mound of pillows for the moment, head tipped back, and eyes sliding shut. He basked in the feel of the office, the feel of Soul Society, familiar presences pulsing around him that had been absent for quite some time. Ichigo felt the weight of his body and the dance of the Reisu around them. The ambience of Soul Society was stunning when one opened their inner eyes. To see that materialistic regality that the afterlife possessed was only a portion, the sprawling streets that shone like carved ivory in sunlight, the Sokioka rising up like a beacon in morning. Both paled in comparison to what happened when Ichigo closed his eyes and looked with his Reisu. Colors swam and intermingled, endless hues twirling and interchanging with each other. Some were faded or soft pastels, statues of kind souls, other were vibrant and sometimes garish, fighters and those filled with life. It was strange that the others couldn't see it. The young Shinigami knew the old man did, they had spoken of it before in one of their many conversations, gazed at the wonder Soul Society filled you with and mentioned the lights. But others, they didn't understand what Ichigo meant when he spoke of such things. Idly Ichigo fingers played with the threads of the surrounding pillows, the crackling shuffle of paper ruffled by the spring breeze drifting from the open window, and silent breaths the only disturbance to the warm silence that was hovering over them. Opening his eyes at the approaching spiritual presence, Ichigo tilted his chin down and faced the door with a raised eyebrow. Having noted the younger Shinigami's attention, the two residents of the room let pensive gazes slide to rest on the trembling door frame. Ichigo couldn't seem to clear his mind of the paper-thin doors, always helping him to hide and take that moment to pause in a breath before entering, and yet in the end they had irrevocably sealed his fate, had been the last sight to greet tired eyes when Rukia had been taken and his life within the realm of the dead only beginning. With a huff, the doors crashed open and the fourth seat appeared in a hazy mess of panting breaths and wide eyes. The petite woman bowed, took a breath of air and calmness, straightened her position and waited for acknowledgement. Ichigo openly smiled at the display, appreciating the woman's control over her actions and emotions. Few could contain whatever urgency was plaguing them, the way the young Shinigami did with such ease. Shunsui nodded for the Shinigami to speak with an easy tip of his hat, settling the female. Reisu peeked in slight worry at the cause for concern. Taeko 6th Seat Kenshin has challenged Lieutenants Shiba and Yodomaru. He is causing a disturbance in the outer training areas centered in the main sequence of the division. Lisa frowned whip sharp, and Ichigo let out a heavy sigh. This was only their first day back and already they were facing trouble. Granted, Zanjitsu was correct in that chaos was more than attracted to him, even infatuation would be putting it lightly. Shunsui scrubbed a hand over his features and sought his two lieutenants, sending them an appraising gaze before he nodded. Did he say anything, or indicate the cause for such an attack? The older man's deep baritone rumbled throughout the crowded space, filling it with his presence and words. The fourth seat flinched nervously, wringing her hands for a moment, before that hidden spine of steel showed through, and Ichigo always knew it was there. He had helped Shunsui pick her of the other initiates. He mentioned something about the vileness of your hollow sides. Ichigo scoffed while Lisa choked back a chortle of laughter. A tinge of snark crept from Ichigo's voice as he commented, and the idiot thought he could beat two lieutenants when he's only a sixth seat. Shunsui chuckled under his breath at Ichigo's words, tipping the brim of his hat as he pondered the situation. Feeling the questioning gaze of his two lieutenants, the man looked up and locked onto their wild will and determination before he inclined his head. Lisa sent Ichigo a knowing stare, and with a nod the two stood up, Reisu pulsing a warning to all who could sense it. It was heaving with the heavy ominous tilt of their acrid Reisu that now resonated always with their Shinigami origins. Taeko will deal with the problem, then we can head out to lunch. Lisa stated nonchalantly, eyes radiating from behind red horned rims. Ichigo grasped the pommel of Zanjitsu's hilt for a moment, taking comfort from the blade's humming Reisu, before he levered to his feet, following the female lieutenant on her path of terror. As much as Ichigo wanted to stand up for the Vizard first and foremost, wield that righteous fury for them, it was their job to gladly show the world what they were made of it. If Ichigo wanted to help on the side, well, that was his choice. Shunsui moved to protest for a moment before he sighed and said, Ma should have known that the training in Hollow would have made you two more reckless. Though Ichi-kun here had always been a bit reckless. The captain paused after sending the two a knowing look. Meanwhile, ignoring Ichigo's soft glare, he whispered comforting words to the small fourth seat, and directed the young woman to the hallways. With a sweep of his palm, Katen Kyokotsu was in his grasp, and the brim of his straw hat had fallen low over his eyes, casting them in dangerous shadow. Together the two lieutenants pushed into the hallway, their Reisu blazing around them like an aura of malintensive fierceness and staining their pupils gold. The Shinigami gathered in the hallways watched on in surprise, eyes wide and mouths hanging open, as the two lieutenants thundered by, presenting a united front in a passing flurry of raven cloth. They were followed by the captain, a blazing calm inferno that presented a chilly smile. The fourth seat timidly trailed behind the three most powerful members of the division and questioned the sixth seat's ignorance. Ichigo breathed in the sweet spring's taunt of outside as they stepped into the courtyard. Spring showers had dusted the area in a miasma of droplets that gleamed like liquid mercury in the light's rays. The division had remained the same through their absences, only the everyday flow of life and the occasional fresh face dissuading Ichigo from believing that the whole event was a dream. A crowd bustled and weaved in the corner like a mound of ants. Tense Reisu poured from that area in waves, and a din of shouting caroled into the air. Connecting eyes with Lisa, the two lieutenants glided over, silent as the brush of air against the new buds of spring. The sixth seat was a hulk of muscle squashed into a square jaw with wide dull eyes. Ichigo wondered how useless men such as these even gained a seat. In the long run, the orange-haired Shinigami suspected they were likely from a wealthy noble family. The cause of the disturbance whipped around, only when Ichigo let Shiro's bloodlust swell from him on heady gales towards the unfortunate Shinigami. Beady black eyes stared at the two lieutenants for a moment, assessing, before he guffawed in a rough, cruel sort of sound that was akin to choking. Look at these worthless Shinigami. They joined with the Hollows. The man announced in a voice full of bravado, instantly attracting the crowds of Shinigami, who had been cowering away with sly steps, attention whether willingly or not held. If the man had any skill, it certainly was gaining the affirmation and attention of the gathered watchers. The bystanders of the incident watched on with varying reactions. Some were horrified by the man's gall and couldn't tear their eyes away from the fast-approaching train wreck, others watched on with vengeful glee in their eyes. The pack mentality of the group was hostile, and Ichigo bit back a curse at the thought of how even now simple minds were swayed by others. Lisa is not worthless. The only people who are worthless are venomous scum like you, Ichigo challenged, shifting to run a hand through wild orange hair. He grasped the pommel of Zanjutsu and let his Reisu spike in warning. The large man flinched even as Lisa shot a concerned gaze in Ichigo's direction at his word choice. Lisa's aquamarine eyes promised that they would be discussing whatever self-worth issues he had stumbled upon at a later date. For now, they would focus on the imbecile basking in the attention of a few of the members of the 8th Division even as he shot glares at his challengers. The man puffed his chest up and Ichigo wondered how one could have so little intelligence, and no fear in the face of their combined Reisu which swirled and thrashed like caged animals. That bitch? She couldn't kick the 12th seat's ass, we all know she's just there to please Teiko. Like all women, worthless and only there to serve men. The man growled out in jeering tones, beady eyes staring at Lisa in the typical way one saw on the streets, the eyeing up and lust that was rotten and left anyone beneath that vile gaze chilled. Ichigo felt anger bubble within his chest like a raging stream of lava coursing through his veins. Taking a deep breath, Ichigo let Zanjutsu's calming Reisu submerge him for the moment. There were many things that could anger him, but misogyny, it curled his wrath like an older sibling who despaired their younger. He had sisters, a mother, and female friends. He knew what they were subjected to all their life. Ichigo was a man, so he knew he would never truly understand what it was like to be in their position, but he could care and listen and try. Lisa bristled beside him, and from behind they could feel the sharp snap of Shunsui's Reisu at the derisive words, "The poor 6th seat would not likely see tomorrow." Reisu furrowed around Lisa, whipping her hair, making the very air seem chill and overcast. The 6th seat only then winced at the visible traces of their power, as tendrils of crimson Reisu curled along Lisa's form in powerful arcs. The man took a hesitant step back, and the few members of the division who had decided this man was quite the intellectual for his views made to hastily scatter. Ichigo darted aside lightning fast, taking down the bystanders who had become accomplices and were trying to flee. With a press to their pressure points, 5 members of the 8th Division dropped to the ground. In a blur of motion and a soft flick of air, Ichigo appeared beside Shunsui, leaving Lisa to face this battle with his support. The man, his name wasn't Kensei, but it started with AK, of that Ichigo was sure, seemed to have regained his bravado, and with a challenging roar that sent the watchers fleeing he unsheathed his katana. Ichigo scoffed as the spirit of the blade, like the rusting guard, its cries rang out for anyone with a decent skill with Reisu to sense. He wondered if the man had even attempted to make contact with the spirit after proving he could. Lisa narrowed her eyes, and in an arc of light glinting from the sun her katana rested loosely in her left hand. For a moment, she considered the blade, staring at it in contemplation before she looked up and into the dull half-lidded eyes of her opponent and said, "I don't even need my katana to beat scum like you." The lumbering giant stared uncomprehending for a moment, before with a guttural howl he charged forward. He moved like a landslide, uncoordinated, a mess, and with great force. However, his opponent was Lisa, and he was doomed to failure the minute he challenged the wizard. Lisa kicked off from the ground, a Reisu-induced jump boosting her high in the air, where she landed behind the man. With an open palm strike into the back of his neck that sent him stumbling, Lisa slid back and raised her hand. "Heido number 31 Shakuho!" The lieutenant yelled out as an orb of charged and pulsing crimson energy slammed into the challenger's chest as he turned around. The man tottered for a moment before he swung his katana overhead in a quick pivot and charged at Lisa. Idly Ichigo summoned his hollow mask, holding casually in his hands where all the remaining viewers could see, a light gesture of intimidation and support. With a soft chortle of amusement, Ichigo watched as Lisa donned her mask, pulling it over her features with wicked curve to her lips and a sharp jolt of Reisu. "Oi Lisa, no using zero. The destruction of to the 8th would be too great, and we don't want to cause too much trouble on our first day back." Lisa looked back, eyes bright and radiant with bloodlust. She acknowledged Ichigo's words with a smirk, though it was hidden by the alabaster of her mask. Ichigo could hear her Zanpakuto purring at the battle, and Shiro reverberated in response at the back of Ichigo's mind. The Shinigami who were unfamiliar with this new Reisu, which was predominantly Shinigami with hollow undertones, flinched, eyes wide and hands drawn to the hilts of their katanas. Even Shunsui beside Ichigo looked awestruck at the mask Lisa now sported and the waves of power that were like an electric current shooting by and enlivening what it touched. Whether that be with fear or excitement depended entirely on the conductor of that current. "Ma-Ichi-chan, the wizard have achieved something truly amazing." Shunsui's baritone rumbled quietly beside Ichigo. He looked up to his captain and nodded, the power that was flowing from Lisa in waves was heavy and instinctive, and Ichigo's own Reisu rose in response. The very air seemed to waver and shimmer like a mirage beneath the force of their power. Shiro purred content as Ichigo's own heart, that Shunsui spoke with no malice and his voice held honesty and a soft fondness. The curly-haired captain cared little about the hollow portion of his Shinigami, only happy to have his lieutenants back. Hollow scum, you shouldn't be breathing. Central 46 should have executed the lot of you when we had the chance. The man bellowed, stopping mid-charge to gaze at that mask, some intendant terror haunting his features even as his voice resounded through the courtyard touched by spring. Ichigo smirked, knowing the man had made a crucial mistake. To insult Lisa based on he gender was one thing, but in insulting their family he had taken a step too far. Hey, asshat, Ichigo, the lieutenant of this division alongside me, a woman who is far more powerful than your pitiful existence, talked to those shitty geezers, he convinced them to accept us, so don't think you know anything. Lisa responded furiously, defending Ichigo and stabbing the man with her words. Ichigo felt a warmth bubble inside his chest at Lisa's actions. He wanted to profusely thank the lieutenant then and there but refrained from the action. Shunsui beamed proudly, gaze languidly drawing from Lisa to Ichigo with a lazy smirk complacently curling his lips. Lisa flicked her katana so that the dull side of the blade was facing the man. She shot a smile to Ichigo, one so full of promise, and a returning one kindled his lips before he could stop the muscles of his features. Swinging her blade to the side, she considered the man for a moment before she quietly voiced, "Insolent fool, gender defines nothing, it is only your actions upon the world." Senmei Arashi. The hum of Lisa's Zanpakuto blade repeatedly contacting with flesh with brutal force resonated around them, and Ichigo glanced up apprehensively, knowing well that Lisa would be fine. He believed in the Shinigami he had trained. He still wanted to glimpse her in that glory of the battle where with the Vizard it was different, primal, and carnal, full of raw bleeding instincts. When the figurative dust cleared, Lisa marched out from the ordeal, katana sealed at her waist, and the lugged giant was being dragged by the nape of his shiksho. With a huff, she dropped him in front of Shunsui, leaving their captain to deal with the man who had suddenly sprouted false propaganda, offended practically every woman ever, and caused endangerment to members of the division. Lisa's hair tangled around her neck in soft feathered waves of raven as she came to stand beside him, the sharp demeanor of her eyes fading as she glanced at Ichigo. He nodded, pride radiating in his own amber orbs, just as he knew the same would be shining in Shunsui's eyes. Lisa awkwardly held up an elastic band inditing the missing hair tie. With a short laugh, Ichigo took the offending piece of equipment, and when Lisa was turned around he whipped her hair into a messy bun. Ichigo had never possessed any fortitude in hairdressing whatsoever, but as an older brother with two female siblings and an older man-child of a father who was practically useless, Ichigo had picked up on a few hair skills. Shunsui's gentle laughter rung out from behind them, and Ichigo craned his head from where he was finishing tucking looping strands of raven into the bun. X. Shunsui shook his head in amusement and fondness at the sight of his two lieutenants, even as they broke apart under his minstrel eyes. The laid-back captain had already noticed the changes prevalent in his lieutenants. Lisa and Ichigo were both more open in a strange sense. Now he could see that their eyes had been like doors with cloudy panes of glass so that the light could shine through, but never fully. Those doors had been blown wide open, and with it a sea of deeper emotions had been revealed. Their Reisu was also different. Where Lisa's had always possessed that clinical seriousness with a gentle touch of amber and honey, it now seeped with undercurrents of something darker. That darkness wasn't bad, because dark never amounted to evil, it was simply a brush of Reisu that was untamed. Ichigo's Reisu had always been constricted to tight bonds whenever they strolled throughout the paved streets of Seoul society. It was only in the comfort and solidarity of presences he knew that the Reisu that simmered like the vast sea roamed and tingled across Shunsui's senses, feral and wild yet tinged with the quiet caress of early mornings in the spring. As the years had droned on, the young man had opened more from those masks he wore to cover the hurt. It was like meeting a new person each day as one factor or experience was revealed and changed Shunsui's view of Ichigo once again. He had come to see the fire-haired soul for more than he presented. The captain of the 8th had seen the hurt and pain that always wearied him like heavy weights or chains imposed upon his shoulders, but he had also seen the determination and undying will that Ichigo possessed, one to match the Suteiko. Now the young man seemed lighter, as if those chains, while not gone, had been shaken loose so that they hung by a narrow margin. He was bright and open as if he had de-aged, become a youth again like his appearance stated. Shunsui had been surprised when Ichigo had stepped inside, and instead of whatever cool tactic he could have employed, he had waited and had let his Reisu Sorin intermingle. Looking at the two as they joked under their breath with beaming smiles painting their features in radiance, Shunsui couldn't help but see the deepened bond between the two. They were like siblings, they had connected well after the first week, Ichigo possessing some delicate touch that appeased Lisa's sense of duty. That relationship was alive like the summer crops, growing and thriving. There was of course the alternative to the light revelations. Possessing hollow powers was no small matter, and Shunsui could only guess the struggles they had gone through to reach the level of comfort they displayed with their powers, not to mention the trust and the bond they shared with their Zanpakuto. Though fate always seemed inclined to construct trials for the fire-haired kid, that mysterious force had let Ichigo suffer before any of them knew. He had dealt with this for years on end, and they had been none the wiser. The report had detailed former instruction, and from Ichigo's testament in front of the senile bastards of 46 it had been difficult and in the end the hard road, compared to what could have been the easy choice to let the captains and lieutenants fall from grace. Thinking of Central reminded him of when the report had first been delivered. Kion had burst in like hellfire incarnate, and Shunsui, even though possessing many years more than the young Shiba heir, felt fear. He had been swallowed by guilt. The crushing defeat and loss of his lieutenants left him feeling hollow. Kion had snapped him out of his funk, whether that was his intention or not. The Shiba heir had slammed Shunsui against a wall, eyes and choking Reisu soaring and raging like monsoon season. It was only Jushiro's intervention that stopped Kion from acting on the threats beating his eyes. Shunsui didn't hold it against the younger man. They had all felt desperate and angry in the following confusion of the mission and Ichigo's lack of presence within Soul Society boundaries. It had been striking how the world seemed so changed without their presences. The warmth Ichigo possessed that flew along the currents of his Reisu had been sorely lacking, and it was only then that Shunsui realized how much he had become accustomed to it. Lisa's task-managing ways had always guided him, and without those chaste smiles and the teasing banter the office had seemed cold and empty. They were changed from the Shinigami he knew before. While Lisa seemed content and at ease with a newfound maturity and calm, one that displayed itself in the way she glided with a new grace and only narrowed her eyes at the sake in plain sight. Ichigo was much the same, possessing a warmth and maturity that was one who had settled into their own skin, like they had been walking in the wrong form. Though his eyes always held a great weariness, and Shunsui was tempted to guide the young man back to the office for a nap. What truly mattered in the end was that the Shinigami under his command who he held dear were safe, and while maybe not completely sound, they were alive. Shaking himself from an old man's musings, Coco Orbs crawled down to rest on the form of his former subordinate. Katen Kyokotsu growled in his mind, urging him to unsheath her and spill blood upon the splendid grass of the inner sect of the 8th Division. Tamping the urge down, Shunsui breathed deeply inside. It both saddened him and angered him immensely to see incidents such as this. Raising a hand, he let his Reisu pulse, calling for the delicate Jigo Kuko. The pale ebony creature fluttered from the sky and landed on his outstretched palm in that silent dance of movement. Leaning forward, Shunsui imparted his message for the 2nd Division Captain Yoriyuki and let the creature flutter on its merry way. Turning his attention to Tsuki, the 4th seat, Shunsui noted the surprise on her features, and underneath a light smattering of awe. A smile painted the curly-haired captain's lips at the thought of more members for his lieutenant's fan club before he beckoned the young women over. "I've called the 2nd Division to take care of the instigator. Can you remain here till they come? We don't want him having any bright ideas and trying to run away." "I'm sure you can do this, you're an excellent Shinigami." The brunette bit her lip for a moment before Shunsui flashed her those assuring eyes, and she nodded with a small smile. Ruffling the chopped locks colliding like a mop on her head, Shunsui straightened and turned his attention to his lieutenants. Lisa was poking Ichigo's chest with a giggle, glasses perched on the bridge of Ichigo's nose as the man attempted to look offended or mildly irritated. The two remained in that position for a split second before laughter burst from their lungs in great peals that drifted on the spring air and elicited laughter to coil from Shunsui's own lips. Rouge tinted their cheeks, and Shunsui tipped his hat forward to shade his eyes as he watched the two playfully banter breathlessly before he padded over. "Any, are we still going out for lunch, Teiko?" Lisa questioned with a quirk of her head. Shunsui nodded and a brighter smile replaced the curious curve of her lips. Ichigo's eyes sparkled for a moment and he settled slightly, Reisu stilling like the calm oceans of the mortal realm. The breeze lifted the branches in greeting shuffling emerald leaves, and Shunsui made a soft shooing motion with his hands gesturing his lieutenants forward. Ichigo shot a petulant frown over his shoulder before the orange-haired kid shrugged it away and beckoned Lisa onwards. Following at a more sedate pace behind the two, Shunsui did a quarter turn, flashing the fourth seat an assuring smile before following the two restless Shinigami. His floral-patterned Haori billowed out behind him like an echo, and he could almost hear Ju's chastising tone lecturing him for leaving the division in such a state. Shunsui knew his division through and through, and while evidently there were some bad spots, he knew they could handle themselves. Departing from the division, Shunsui let his Reisu and the aura around him settle fractionally, as he increased his speed to a brisk pace so that he could reconvene with Ichigo and Lisa. The ebony-haired lieutenant smiled at him over her shoulder, warm and sweet like summer nights and rich sake, before she turned to face Ichigo, discussing the lieutenant's apparent skills in the kitchen. Shunsui smiled to himself, content to listen to their conversation as they entered the bustling streets of Rungokai. The streets outside of Siridi were a maze of old buildings, that no matter how precarious they appeared remained steadfastly standing. They were a miasma of boards and wood with whatever other material thrown in for good measure. The spring air had prompted some sort of festival, and banners of colorful cloth streamed from eave to eave, draping with their weight and catching the sunlight like a deep wine. Vendors called out their wares, displaying a variety of items ranging from produce to bejeweled sword hilts which served little purpose other than beauty. The senses of the little world outside of Siridi was heavy and vibrant. Noise churned and rose, the yelling of markets, the soft chatter of accomplices gliding through the crowds, bells shimmered and tinkled like fey laughter rising above the muted hum of life. The sultry fragrances of passing ladies wafted on the heavy air, accompanied by the roasting meats that sent smoke spiraling like wisps of heaven against a clear blue backdrop. Men lumbered with the weight of the humid air, and a fruity undercurrent of sweet berries was potent enough to draw Shunsui's eyes to row upon row of berries colored crimson, purple, dark violet, and pink. Catching a spark of orange drifting ahead once more, Shunsui sighed and ran a hand through curly strands, wondering how anyone had ever attempted to stay with the kid. Narrowly dodging the cloying press of bodies as people shuffled to and fro, large ox carts meandering through the streets. Tilting the brim of his straw hat to shade his eyes from the ponderous sun, Shunsui followed the bobbing path of Reisu Ichigo had left like a trail of will-o'-the-wisps. Ichigo, do you honestly think Byakuya will hate you? You warned him about your absence, so don't worry. I swear sometimes you fret like a teenage girl. Lisa commented slyly as Shunsui came up behind them, flashing Ichigo a teasing wink from behind the crimson of her glasses where they had been returned to their rightful position on the bridge of her nose. Ichigo blushed, the color close to his hair as it painted his cheeks, and the man made to vehemently deny her words. Before thinking better of it, he turned and waved to Shunsui. Captain, where are we eating at? Ichigo questioned with a curious tilt to his head, and Shunsui paused for a moment, trying to remember the name of the pub. He could picture it in his mind with that swinging sign and roaring great fireplace, and in the back the small sunroom with misty windows that opened and swayed like a gentle breeze. The Ivory Dragon, Jushiro has been wanting to visit again. He favors their jasmine blend. Lisa nodded familiar recognition, flipping her features. Ichigo on the other hand cocked his head, eyes going distant in the way they usually did when he was searching for information. Before he blinked and it was gone. He shrugged, a motley mixture of confusion hidden under the shadow of orange locks. Sidling between the two as they let their captain take the lead, Shunsui considered them for a moment before he asked, "How was your training? Am I allowed to ask that, or is that strictly wizard information?" Ichigo blinked dully for a moment, processing the question before a pleased smile originated on his lips. Feeling a slight speck of confusion at Ichigo's beaming pride, he turned to Lisa and arched an eyebrow. Ichigo thought of the name, though we didn't know it was in common use already. Lisa breathed with a laugh, twirling a strand of jet black between nimble fingers. The information gave Shunsui pause, and he thinks he was beginning to see what Shinji meant when he voiced the need for Ichigo to gain captaincy. It had seemed in the beginning as if Ichigo had left only to oversee the training that was required, but now if Shunsui opened his eyes he could see the respect and quiet understand that all the hollow-eyed Shinigami presented when they gazed at Ichigo. The name Vizard was also unique, and Shunsui wondered how they had come upon it. He had heard the name used the night before when Yamji had called his two oldest students to his office for a bottle of sake and discussions regarding certain orange-haired Shinigami. Ichigo, having shaken himself from wherever his mind usually wandered in the moments of lull between conversation, perked up and replied, completely oblivious to Lisa's words. "If we tell you, we'll have to kill you." Ichigo spoke in a totally serious voice, body hunched low and a whisper coating his voice. Releasing himself from the crouch with a light spring, he winked and flipped around before continued, "The training was great. I feel the Shinigami who experienced it definitely developed their powers, but I feel they deepened their cores." "Nay Lisa, do you think I'm right?" Lisa rested a head under her chin pensively at Ichigo's words, while a fond grin curled her lips. Shunsui shook his head in sweet amusement at Ichigo's teasing. After a minute of contemplation as they strolled along under the eaves of leafy boughs that reached to trail against their cheeks, Lisa nodded and said, "You're right Ichigo, we feel like a family and I feel free in a way I didn't think I could feel, and it's all thanks to you Ichi." Lisa ended her tirade on a light note, reaching over to ruffle Ichigo's mess of hair that collected like bird feathers around his neck and ears. The young man blushed and spluttered for a minute to the amusement of the other two Shinigami before he half yelled, "What? You guys would have been fine on your own, there's no need to thank me." Lisa only shook her head in exasperation, knowing that her words and the honesty behind them would not likely reach Ichigo. When it came to Ichigo's self-esteem and accepting gratitude, he was as thick as an iron wall. Repeating Lisa's earlier dangerous action, Shunsui ran a hand through Ichigo's hair, marveling at the softness even as the kid squawked and jumped away, hands vehemently swatting at them before coming up to defend his skull. "Geez, my hair is already enough of a mess as it is, stupid Shiba genetics, I don't need you two messing it up even further." Shunsui and Lisa laughed at the petulant pout planted firmly on Ichigo's lips. Deciding to steer the topic away from whatever melancholy Ichigo would inevitably sink into regarding the Shibas, because he was one though the melodramatics were slightly more tamed, he turned to Lisa and said, "Would you two be willing to demonstrate some of your new powers?" Lisa instantly nodded, before with a hesitant cast to cerulean blue eyes she locked eyes with Ichigo, awaiting his nod. The young man sighed with an amused curve to his lips before he nodded. "Some of the stuff we learned was amazing, but you should see Ichigo's resurrection." Lisa babbled excitedly, ignoring Ichigo's long-suffering sigh as the lieutenant tipped his head back to gaze at the sky. Shunsui wondered what a resurrection was and contented himself with the idea that he would find out soon enough. Besides, if it was something Ichigo possessed, it was sure to be unique at least. Kami Shunsui remembered the shock of seeing the Shinigami's Shikai, only an academy student at the time, wielding that Shikai so uniquely shaped. The spirits of the blade had roared and Shunsui had felt shock like a ship plow into his system, along with a trace of awe. Because it had never seemed like Ichigo possessed two spirits, and was that really his Shikai, but he had felt it then. 2 points of light infinitely different, one teeming with feral instincts, the other like a pool of cold ice. In the distance, a head of white perched next to a wooden sai swaying with the wind caught their attention. Shunsui felt a smile blossom on his lips at the sight of his partner. Jushiro was crouched along a narrow wall, eyes serene as he watched Rungokai's busy hustle of life whirl around him. Those calm sea-green eyes widened when they glimpsed the two lieutenants. "Lisa, Ichigo, it's lovely to see you both again," he greeted as he beckoned them into light hugs, always aware of Ichigo's discomfort with contact, which had settled somewhat in the time Shunsui knew him. Lisa looked at the genial captain with a fond quirk to her features as she reached up and pecked the man on the cheek. Shunsui laughed as a blush dusted Jushiro's pale skin and Ichigo joined him while the others were left to catch their breath. Laughter soon rang throughout the group and Shunsui felt Katen Kyoko purr in the back of his mind. Ichigo beamed light and airy like a wild sprite and didn't say anything, the silence speaking his joy, like the waves of Reisu that curled around them. Shunsui connected with Jushiro's deep eyes, like the fathomless coasts finding the slow-burning love that always seeped teal orbs when he gazed at Shunsui. 1,000 words passed between them as they stared at the two lieutenants gaily talking beside the sign. With a wave of his hand and a gentle push they entered the restaurant and Shunsui flashed one last glance at the midday sun as it painted the land in hues of deep gold and amber wine, before he turned his head. Jushiro caught his hand and pulled him inside, following the bouncy laughter of the younger Shinigami. Shunsui felt the world that had stopped start turning once more. X. Chapter 25, Gazelig. X. Ichigo woke with a gasp, shooting forward from the heavy warmth of the blankets that felt all at once suffocating in the wake of his sleep-clouded mind. He was trembling, choking on invisible blood, and the words that could never leave his lips. Night furrowed its wings around him as the curtains swayed precariously, sending eerie shadows to chase at his heart. Drawing his knees into his chest, Ichigo attempted to calm his shuddering form, watching with a distant apathy as his hands shook in front of his eyes. His breath continued to rattle from his lungs, and Ichigo hastily wrapped his arms around his knees, tucking his features into the small crevice as he continued to try to breathe. Zanjutsu's calming waves of Reisu hummed around Ichigo, but the young Shinigami was numbed to the sensation. It was his fault, their deaths, every single one of them. The thought was swirling in his mind, an endless vortex. His own mind turned against him as it constantly tormented Ichigo with their last moments played over and over in gruesome detail. How could it not be his fault? He was too weak to save anyone in the end. Kami, he felt sick. Some part of him deep inside was aching, pounding in his ears, forcing him to live even as the excruciating pain of loss rattled every bone within his body. Ichigo was falling apart. Every day spent seeing the dead walk by him, feel their touch upon his brow. Knowing that they would never be the same as the ones he knew, they would never be the people he had given his life to. He had changed the timelines, changed their fates. The world was screwed up because of him, and the young lieutenant had no way of predicting what would happen. It snagged at the burrow of his mind that he would lose them all again, hold limp corpses in his arms because he had failed once more. What meager attempts at regaining his calm faded as Ichigo's breath became ragged, Reisu tearing around the room and ripping at whatever it touched. Glazed amber orbs were slowly revealed as Ichigo lifted his head. A low keening sound left his lips. He needed fresh air. The cloying heaviness of the room was chasing like the darkness of his soul, what greedy clawed talons dragged him down. But he couldn't find the strength to move, as if suspended in that moment by invisible marionette strings, forced to hear their last words play and rattle in his mind. Kami, he was so useless. It hurt deep within him, and Ichigo duly thought that he deserved to have to deal with the nightmares for what he had let happen to his family. A light seeped from the thin shoji doors at the far end of the room. A small orb of sunshine bounced along and illuminated sharp features. Reisu leaped out from the man standing there, rushing forward to envelop Ichigo and tame the swirling miasma of emotions that bubbled out violently. Ichigo felt the tenseness evaporate slightly as Kaien's familiar presence danced around him, soothing away the pain in his heart and reminding Ichigo of what he was here for. Their assurances became heavy at the forefront of his mind, their voices humming with honesty as they told him it wasn't his fault, as they carted through soft hair and soothed away his fears. Kaien's Reisu hesitantly drew back, and Ichigo let it, grounded in the moment and pulled from the veritable hurricane of disaster he had been rolling in. Ichigo's older brother's presence whispered against the shell of his ear, softly brushing stray strands of orange in a comforting gesture and soothing restless nerves. Then Kaien continued on his way, a soft sigh leaving his lips audible even to Ichigo, one not of exasperation but the weight of the hour. Summoning strength from Zanjutsu, whose worried calls echoed resonantly in the back of his mind, along with the curl of their Reisu. Ichigo slipped from the covers and dove towards the window, flinging open the heavy frame. He stood there panting, illuminated in the moonlight and chased by night's errant winds. Stealing one's last glance at the shadow-enslaved walls of his room, Ichigo in a rather gale movement slipped onto the roof. The crisp night air teased feathered orange locks and brushed away the dwindling sense of panic. The sting of cool air as it brushed his lungs helped Ichigo to rein in his erratic breathing, and with slow and controlled movements he lifted his head to stare at the moonlit surroundings. With the pulse of Zanjutsu's Reisu, his two spirits were resting on either side of him. Zanjutsu Asen's calming and steadfast presence was wrapped around Ichigo's still lightly trembling frame, and a large warm hand carefully brushed aside stray orange locks and settled ochre glasses on the crown of Ichigo's head. Zanjutsu Shiro wrapped his arms around the still slightly trembling frame, drawing a sharp breath to Ichigo's lungs at the cool skin even as comforting waves of Reisu emanated from the contact. Ichigo tipped his head back for a moment, realigning his thoughts as he steadily cleared his mind of the fog of his nightmares. The sky was dyed a deep indigo, and the Lady Moon was luminous and full in her starry canvas, winking down at Ichigo. In a controlled manner of deep breaths, with fists clenched in the available fabric imbued with his spirit's presence, Ichigo slowly went through a small mantra. He assured himself that he was not weak, that it wasn't indeed not his fault, and that in the end he didn't kill them. It was a routine that had instated itself on Anohana's end, surpassingly, Shunsui's advice. Even if Ichigo usually didn't believe the words he muttered under his breath, it helped to settle his heart and mind. Shiro purred contently, waves of Reisu open in the bleached spirit's way, cocooning around Ichigo and easing the strain of his body. Damn king, and we were doing so well. Shiro muttered under his breath, lacking any malintent and possessing only a concerned sincerity. Ichigo had to agree. The nightmares that had ruthlessly chased his dream while they trained with the Vizard had eased as the month drew to a close, leaving him able to grasp some much-needed rest. Yet here they were again in full terrifying force. Ichigo wanted them to stop but could see no viable option. Instead he reached out, taking Shiro's cool hand into his own, feeling a matching mirror of calluses and scars. Zanjutsu Asen hummed thoughtfully, long spindly fingers trailing through vibrant orange locks. You did well though, Ichigo, you managed to calm yourself. You are healing, though perhaps it is taking a time. I believe you can. Zanjutsu Asen spoke softly and deeply, reassuring Ichigo's own thoughts on the matter. Ichigo sighed softly, gazing up warmly through tired fluttering lashes in gratitude at his two spirits before he settled into their forms, eyes gazing at the horizon around them. The Shiba compound stretched for miles on end, a vast rolling plain of green where forests steepled themselves upon the land. Ichigo remembered times when Ganju and he had embarked into those forests, run wild beneath limbering boughs for hours chasing their shadows. The memory brought a faint smile to his lips and quelled the simmering discomfort of his soul. In the distance, the land stretched on, fading into shadows and soft blues. Ichigo sometimes stared at the horizon and wanted to just go. Walk along those paths and see what mystery they held, embrace the world for all its wonder. It was a deep spark within himself that he had carried all his life, always repressed but for that 1 year when he had been free, itching beneath his skin and urging him to embark. Kami, how he would love to leave it all behind. The responsibilities, worries, lies, power struggles, and everything that made up this mundane life of his. Mundane was a relatively loose term. But he couldn't, because he had family to protect, and so he stayed, as he always did. He contented himself with the thought that one day he could grace those roads and never look back, maybe even with Byakuya by his side, tasting the fruits of other worlds, interacting with complete strangers. With a wistful sigh, Ichigo blinked and tilted his head to gaze at the moon once more, settled with his thoughts of the future. One day everyone would know, or at least understand, and it would be worth it in the end, but for now he would tame that infamous Shiba wanderlust and merely stare at the deepening sky. Byakuya craned his head up, slightly startled at the familiar Reisu that caressed his skin warmly, a heady evanescence of night fluttering about the room in the familiar grace of Ichigo's Reisu. His presence had flared into existence once more only a few nights prior, after nearly a month without it, and the Kukaki air felt a touch of spite like simmering spices that only now was he seeing his friend. Those weighted emotions had been accompanied by the unaccountable relief that Ichigo was back. Now, in the quiet moments of the afternoon where lazy pastimes occurred and the mind wandered, the orange-haired Shinigami was waiting there in front of him. Ichigo leaned against the doorframe of the office, a casual smile settled on his lips and a relaxed easiness in his posture, even as it was underlain by the sorrow and guilt painting his brow. It sent Byakuya's nerves ringing around his head in glee or some other sparked existence. Whatever control he possessed of his emotions was lost the moment he appeared, though the Kukaki mask remained as impassive as always. Ignoring ensnaring ember eyes, Byakuya glanced at Jinrei, his grandfather, who was by now familiar with Ichigo's untimely appearances. The old man sighed as if having expected this interruption to their schedule and knew that Byakuya would not likely return. There was something deeper in the movement, a sharpness that struck Byakuya as distrust or some instinct hit like the gongs of war. The older man looked up at his grandson with that softer steel of his eyes that was reserved for very few. Then his captain shook his head in an amused manner before gesturing with a fond push of his Reisu that ruffled Byakuya's locks. Byakuya let his head rise once more to truly glimpse Ichigo, see what he had passed over in his accessory glance. It had been a month since they last saw each other, and time longer since they spoke in that grove. Ichigo's word like the desperate cry of a madman as he spoke fevered sentences to Byakuya. The young man before him was Ichigo, yet there were changes that he easily grasped, having known Ichigo for far too long. His hair was longer since it was last cut, curling upon the nape of his shoulders, and it was always the first thing to attract Byakuya's attention because that color was so eye-catching and defying, like an embodiment of chaos and Ichigo's soul. Next, he noted the way Ichigo's body was tensed, not in the typical alertness he carried with him everywhere. This was a nervous kind of tense, pushed aside for the false display of calm and ease. Byakuya observed the bright catch of light as it hit ivory, and crimson-stained silver orbs widened, because he knew Ichigo sometimes went to extreme lengths and was as stubborn as mule. To see a piercing though, was shocking enough to leave a smile stretching Byakuya's lips because that was something so inordinately Ichigo. From there his eyes traced the familiar structure of Ichigo's features, the ones he had spent countless hours staring at. Whether that be training when their breaths mingled like their will, or under the curtains of stars on a bed of soft glass, where soft whispers of the future pervaded. His roaming gaze centered on Ichigo's eyes, and what was found drew the breath from Byakuya's lungs and made his heart skip a beat. Ichigo's eyes had never been so open, at least not in broad daylight. When they had crashed together in one of the dorm rooms after whatever project had nabbed their attention. There were those moments in the dead of morning, when Ichigo would jerk awake panting and heaving. His pupils would be blown wide and Byakuya felt he was looking into a void unable to pull back. It was almost that feeling, except this wasn't a void pulling and tearing at him, this was the sky. That blue arc so tempestuous could cloud over and rain upon the world with thunder and lightning, and yet at the same time clouds would lazily glide burnished in soft hues of the sunset. Emotions swelled there as they stared into the other's eyes, and Byakuya could see the recognition and soft fondness that always hummed beneath the layers of uncaring stoniness. There in great waves of sloughing weary could Byakuya see a deep tiredness, as if Ichigo's time away from Soul Society had not served to recuperate his strength. Merely drain him all the more so. It clanged furiously in Byakuya's chest and he wanted to command the younger to spill his ire, but he refrained. Byakuya realized then, considering deep eyes full of sentimental emotions, that he had missed Ichigo. Time has always seemed to drag on incredibly slow and be gone in the blink of an eye. The month had whipped by, yet occasionally Byakuya would find himself looking for a presence that he knew wasn't there. There had been a tugging in his soul. A fraction of pain like a splinter that relentlessly pestered him and grew sharper with each day. Soul Society without Ichigo's presence had been hollow and devoid of some otherworldly touch. He had missed the laughter and subdued touch of his friends Reisu, the way they curled and mixed together, their spars and the sake under moonlit nights. Looking at Ichigo seemed to bring those emotions into center so that he was suddenly breathless in understanding. There had been a feeling of wrong for so long and only now did Byakuya guess as to what it might be. The lieutenant's heart thudded in his chest as if painfully aware of the faint burning in his eyes. He could almost hear Senbonzakura's chiding laugh and feel the reassuring press of Reisu from his Zanpakuto spirit. Byakuya swept his eyes over Ichigo once more, taking in the appearance of his friend as his Reisu tentatively snaked out to entangle with the fire-haired lieutenants. Ichigo surged out in a mess of excitement and eagerness and crashed into him like waves breaking upon the shore. It was feral, with the tangible taste of the night, and it was Ichigo. Stealing one last glance at his grandfather, who had been watching their reunion with amusement, all the while managing to direct half glares in Ichigo's direction as if the Kukaki head couldn't be decided whether he was the caring grandfather or clan head. The old man shared a look with his grandson before he nodded, and Byakuya bounded from his seat, striding across the short interval of space between them. They shared a loaded gaze heavying the weight of their brows and furrowing the corners of their lips. They were going to speak, and likely walk, but for now their main goal was to leave the office. Ichigo turned first a step ahead of Byakuya, the tails of his clothing and locks of feathered orange whispering out of sight a step ahead of Byakuya. In an awkward half-pivot Byakuya waved to his captain and darted after Ichigo. Ichigo stood at the entrance to the secluded gardens of the 6th Division, seemingly immobilized in the moment set in stone. The sun in its hasty retreat across the sky fawned over Ichigo, embossing him in gold, tangling his hair into actual flames. For a moment Byakuya's eyes deceived him, and the man before him was like a being of pure light, tall and firm with a will that was radiating like the luminescent beings of the sky. Then Ichigo turned and the eminence of the moment was lost, to be replaced by the pure curl of Ichigo's lips. That invigorating smile was directed in Byakuya's direction, followed by a beckoning hand. Byakuya, never one to be able to resist those eyes, came to stand beside Ichigo. The two stared out upon the garden, where the koi pond soothed the world around them with its methodic melodies. So, a piercing. Ichigo choked out a laugh, head whipping around to catch the light airy bubble of Byakuya's own mirth. Subconsciously or not, the Shinigami lieutenant moved away the locks of orange so that Byakuya could clearly glimpse the new addition to his friend. Tentatively reaching forward to grasp the irregular shape clinging to the shell of Ichigo's ear, Byakuya shuddered at the presence coating the bone-like material. Needed a change, and it was maybe an impulsive decision. Byakuya wanted to retort to that subtle wording, change indeed, like his disappearance from Soul Society, but he let the matter fall to where it simmered in his heart. They would discuss it all eventually. Letting his hand drop to rest at Senbonzakura's pommel, Byakuya let a fond chuckle escape his lips. Ichigo was impulsive, and it was nice of the younger male to finally admit to such. It was something he could only expect of Ichigo. Silence lingered between the two, undisturbed by the roll of Reisu against their skin, as they realigned themselves with one another, fitted into the slots they had carved into the other's soul. Ichigo shamelessly reached out to hold Byakuya's hand, drawing strength from the contact. Ichigo wasn't a man for touch, or at least outwardly it didn't appear so, but Byakuya knew sometimes the orange-haired Shinigami needed to feel that confirmation that it was all still real. His pulse hummed beneath Byakuya's fingertips, fluttery and fast like life itself, and the familiar callous of the long days spent with katana in hand made themselves known. Eventually Ichigo sighed and released Byakuya's hand before slumping to the wooden steps. Amber eyes looked up from a hood of tangerine into Byakuya's own eyes. The Kukaki heir let out a soft sigh before joining his friend on the wooden deck. The air between them was calm and serene, and they both took the time to bask in the other's presence. Words were hard when for them it had always been the telling press of Reisu and their profound understanding of the other, so the words like a multitude of choruses remained within Byakuya's lungs as they watched the endless skies stretch on. What next? Any other adventures I should be warned about? Byakuya questioned softly, turning to gaze at his friend with a deepness in his own eyes that thrashed like a sea beneath his skin. Ichigo stared, assessing before he shrugged in a nonchalant manner. The wind blew around them, suddenly ruffling their clothing and tearing at their hair. Ichigo tilted his head back and laughed. It was a wild, soft kind of laugh that incited Byakuya's lips to turn in a knowing smile. Who knows, according to my Zanpakuto I am merely an instrument of chaos. Ichigo spoke after taking a calming few breaths. His eyes were alight in the outside air and so very open that Byakuya felt he could drown, like a man cast adrift into the wide plains of the ocean. Ichigo shoved teasingly at Byakuya's shoulder and under his breath mumbled, "Missed ya." Byakuya nodded, the words caught in his throat, dying to be replaced with an exasperated huff and a ruffle of feathered orange locks. Like that, the anger that simmered at the emptiness inside was gone. They were together once more, and even though the worry and chaotic nature of being friends with Ichigo was there, so was the fiery Shinigami's smile and presence. Ichigo swatted at his hand, an annoyed expression playing across his features, before with a wink of sunshine mischief took over his visage. Duly in the back of his mind he could hear Senbonzakura's groan mirroring Byakuya's own. Before the ebony-haired lieutenant could dart away, Ichigo's hand zipped in lightning fast and tapped him on the shoulder, and in a blur of ebony and orange he was springing away with a yelled tag. Never one to let such a challenge hang between them, Byakuya darted to his feet and sprang after Ichigo, Reisu circling through his body as Flash Step brought him closer to the beaming figure. They darted around the lush greenery with bright soaring Reisu and laughter light on their lips. Kami Byakuya hadn't felt this alive and exhilarated in a long time, because as much as soul society was what he fought for, on a lower level perhaps than family, these times were quiet and only the incident with the Vizard had sparked action. So, to have mindless fun with his friend soothed that restless part of him. Springing forward from the low crouch Byakuya had dropped into, he flicked his eyes forward sharp as a hunter. Ichigo's head shot up like a deer caught in the eyes of a predator. The innocent expression remained for a half-second before Ichigo was darting away like a gazelle. With a huff, Byakuya picked up speed, always one step behind the trailing tails of Ichigo's Shiakusho. Ichigo had gotten fast, or maybe he had always been fast and had stopped holding back on his monstrous reserves of power. The latter option seemed the likeliest choice, as Ichigo always had secrets tucked up his sleeves and threaded through his hair, along with a sense of power that just swamped his form. Byakuya narrowly thought this as he ducked out of the way of a sweeping jab to the chin. Somewhere along the way of their friendly game of tag had devolved into a half-spar, where they weren't wrath-throwing punches so much as trying to tackle the other into the vibrant earth below. Ichigo stumbled as Byakuya swept out his leg, intercepting the other's attempt at a kick. The orange-haired lieutenant wobbled for a moment, thrown off balance, before he righted himself, or appeared to. Because the next thing Byakuya knew, his arms were full of Ichigo and he was firmly pressed to the earth with the air leaving his lungs in a parted gasp. Ichigo looked down upon him innocently, eyes glimmering like a fey spirit, and Byakuya was a little uncomfortable with their position, but he shrugged it aside in an effort to throw the demon off his body. Ichigo just grinned down at him, laughter bubbling from his lips, and Byakuya couldn't help but join in. Senbonzakura purred deeply in his mind, chasing Byakuya's thoughts incessantly, and he pushed those tangling words aside. Instead, with a bright gleam of silver, Byakuya reversed their position so that Ichigo was the one sprawled in the long grass. Orange sprawled like a halo, and Ichigo gazed up at him, wonder and fondness glimmering brightly in his expression. They rolled around in the grass for a few moments, trying to topple the other as the sun beat down upon their figures, and if there were a few grass stains and breathlessness to accompany their play fighting, they were none the wiser. Panting, Byakuya settled into the firm earth below, his breath escaping his lungs as the exertion of their tussle caught up with him. Ichigo was right there beside the black-haired lieutenant. A peaceful smile that was small but sincere freed his lips, and Byakuya wanted to immortalize that smile. It stirred his heart and coiled his own lips. Not to mention seeing Ichigo happy just brightened the world around him. The skies were endlessly blue above them with nary a sign of puffy white clouds in sight. It reminded Byakuya of their days in the academy, and he felt familiar nostalgia thinking of those days. Everything always seemed so much simpler in the past. There wasn't the endless paperwork, rather essays and reports, but those were less numerous. There wasn't the overbearing weight and responsibility of the division weighing one's shoulders. Byakuya knew and acknowledged somewhat reluctantly at the back of his mind that he would have to assume captaincy within a few years. The thought both terrified and invigorated him. The recent meeting still stood stark in his mind, like Hirako Teiko's words. Byakuya could only agree with the blonde. Ichigo would make a damn excellent captain. He possessed some unnatural charisma that turned one's enemies into allies. The older lieutenant had seen it before, saw it at that meeting, because while Byakuya was far from the loop of information, he understood what Ichigo hadn't said that day in the clearing. Lieutenant Aizen had always rustled Senbonzakura the wrong way, even while he appeared as a benign and caring man. Yet the reports had detailed things from behind the lines, and though an instigator wasn't clearly named, Byakuya could draw conclusions. Seeing that man standing with the vizard, primarily near Kisuke, was only evident to Byakuya's belief in Ichigo. The cunning lieutenant was now allied with Ichigo, and that devotion they all possessed in regard to Ichigo had radiated. There was also Ichigo's presence, one that commanded and drew you in. It was like that at the meeting, all eyes riveted on the orange-haired Shinigami as he spoke through the report and challenged them all with fiery risen amber. A rustle and shift of the presence next to him dragged Byakuya from his trailing thoughts that the serene atmosphere had captivated. Turning his head, a fraction, Byakuya was met with wide chocolate eyes that stared into his soul unerringly. Rolling over so as to better face Ichigo, Byakuya let an amused smile dance across his lips. Soft laughter left Ichigo's lips in the space between them and kindled Byakuya's own laughter. It was the kind of laughter that could occur when two friends stared at each other, for absolutely no reason at all. After settling down some after their sudden unplanned laughter with breathless glee and ache in their stomachs and cheeks, Byakuya considered Ichigo and asked, "Are you happier now?" Ichigo quirked at an eyebrow, a small frown furrowing his brow as he thought over the question before. With a slight shrug he answered, "I think so. The time away from Soul Society was good for me. It's cloying, choking to be in the same place for so long, surrounded by the same routine. I'm also allowed to be free now. Everyone accepts that we have a hollow nature within us." Byakuya nodded and grinned at those words, the infamous Shiba wanderlust lingering in Ichigo's voice. They all carried it, some held onto it stronger than other clan members. Byakuya remembered with a slight tinge of fondness that was overwhelmed with the other vibrant emotions of the memory when Ichigo had just disappeared. They had all awoken between one day and the next to find Ichigo gone. He had appeared a week later with a beaming smile and a lightness to his step, and when they questioned him he had only winked and carried on humming some new rhythm under his breath. The later half of Ichigo's words resonated with Byakuya, because it was true. Oh, there had already been complications, but that was much the manner of Soul Society. Byakuya himself found no ire or trouble with the concept of the hollow-fied Shinigami. He knew others struggled with it, but when Byakuya had known Ichigo through thick and thin, held him in the darkness of the night and shared their demons, it was easy to settle into the idea. "That's good. How was training?" Byakuya grinned and questioned, wanting to know more about the month that had been lost between them. Ichigo laughed, blinking slowly and in a relaxed manner. Idle fingers carded through his hair as he stared at Byakuya. "It was hellish but fun. We first had to make contact with their Zanpakuto spirits and reignite their bonds, which were quite tattered and in danger of collapsing. Then we had to move to technique, which I'll show you some eventually, and then master that." Ichigo laughed and then spoke tone light, and Byakuya knew the man could go on for days and talk about all the experiences he had gained, so Byakuya let him continue to speak. He listened as Ichigo detailed the captains and lieutenants who had been hollow-fied, and some of them he knew, but others he was unfamiliar with. He talked about the scientists and their midnight discussions, because Ichigo was an insomniac through and through, though that didn't belly the weariness in his eyes. The dinners and breakfasts and all other manners of conversation and humor that would drift between them on whatever wispy thoughts occupied him. The flame-haired Shinigami's eyes sparkled in that brilliant untapped happiness that was rare but bountiful as the plains when it was left free. Byakuya was happy that these Shinigami could bring such emotion to Ichigo's eyes, even as he wished he could have done the same. But Ichigo thrived on people, protecting them, cherishing them, living with them. In Soul Society, he could do that, but he was far from close to everybody, too many people and clashing personalities. It was different when one was crammed into a living space for a month and told to get along, Byakuya supposed. What about you, Byakuya? Get up to any mischief without me? Ichigo asked, having fallen silent as the lulling hum of the world surrounded them. Byakuya rolled his eyes slightly, racketing his mind for thoughts of the past month. Had he done anything interesting? It had seemed routine as usual, just empty, but then again nothing was normal or ever stationary within Soul Society. Nothing half as crazy as what you whipped up, but Byakuya paused, wondering if he should speak about her or just whisk away to the antics of the 11th Division. But Ichigo was pinning him with those curious eyes, and Byakuya with a resigned sigh began again. I met a lady. I doubt you recall that time some many days ago when we exited a restaurant and bumbled into a woman. Ichigo gave him a blank stare, though Byakuya felt he could see touches of recognition within amber orbs. Shaking his head in amusement, Byakuya thought of her and began to speak again. Her name's Hisuna, and we met again when I was on patrol. We went out for tea and it escalated from there. Byakuya turned his head, gazing into Ichigo's fathomless soul, asking if the man wanted him to continue. A tiny smile was painted on Ichigo's lips, one that was both content and distant, eyes hazing in that thoughtful way they sometimes did. But Ichigo nodded, wanting his friend to continue, and so Byakuya with a half-sigh spoke of Hisuna. She's from Rungokai and I doubt Jinrei will be happy with her, but she's wonderful and beautiful, and so kind. We've only gone out twice, but I feel as if I've already fallen. Or at least I think I have. Have you ever fallen in love, Ichigo? Byakuya's eyes were dreamy as he spoke about Hisuna, the young soul who often occupied his thoughts as much as Ichigo often did. Yet Byakuya was relatively unexperienced with these kinds of circumstances. As a noble he had been introduced to droves of women, all emblazoned in kimonos and the epitomes of grace and refinement. They had never interested Byakuya, always seeming two-dimensional and lacking personality. Few people caught his attention like that in any case. So Byakuya was left somewhat confused, and Ichigo, his confidant and friend, seemed to be one of the veritable sources to turn to, even if Ichigo didn't strike him as an overly amorous person. Ichigo blinked, somewhat surprised, before he cocked his head and giggled quietly into his palm. Then he was staring into Byakuya's eyes with that lingering sadness that always haunted his past, even if it was tamed under the happiness of their reunion. Yeah, many times I guess. But each time was different, and each level of love is different. Sometimes you love a person for what they represent, like freedom, or even love itself. Other time it's the person who has your heart, their smile, the curve of their features. In the end, sometimes it's their soul, and you can't escape so much as you wish to run to them. Love is fleeting and fragile, yet contradictory in that it is unmovable and tempered like diamonds. Ichigo spoke in a kind of fervent tone, as if desperate to get his message across to Byakuya. He paused at the end as if considering continuing speaking of his own experiences, before he dismissed the idea. He looked at Byakuya, eyes taking in his form with an intense wonderment, and Byakuya felt a light blush dust his cheeks at the heated gaze before he was staring at Ichigo in return, trying to see the meaning behind Ichigo's careless choice of phrase. If you ever want to hear about my exploits, well, let's just say sake will be involved. Otherwise you'll know, there will be that fluttering in your chest, and you want to be with that person all the time. And usually your Zanpakuto knows before you. Ichigo spoke in a laughing tone as he glanced at the sky, a wry sort of longing and nostalgia clinging to his brow. Byakuya thought on Ichigo's words, considered them, and listened to Senbonzakura's own hum that resonated along the back of his mind. The spirit was chuckling in amusement, though for what reason Byakuya couldn't say. He could feel Senbonzakura's laughter and mumbled words distorted by the fact that they weren't speaking face to face, or his spirit's intentions. It's all rushing so close, live currents surrounding me and passing in the breath of a moment. Ichigo was quiet as he spoke, drifting into that tone of voice where his mind was far elsewhere but his heart was weighted to the earth below. Byakuya shifted slightly so he could stare at Ichigo. The Shinigami was staring up at the skies above, features soft and open. The moments hung between them, silence drifting like the lazy waves of air that playfully ruffled their locks and chastised their clothing. Ichigo's Reisu like the warmth of the sun above snaked around them, and Byakuya felt the familiar presence of his friend brush over his hands and trail hesitantly over his heart, as if assessing that the organ still stuttered out a familiar rhythm. Byakuya let his own Reisu surge from his skin, tangle with Ichigo's and assure the man of whatever his soul was asking. The stillness was broken as faint laughter left Ichigo's lips before it grew louder, ringing throughout the empty courtyard. Byakuya felt resounding laughter slip from his own lips, in the way the Ichigo so often incited. With a cocked eyebrow, Byakuya turned to his friend, catching ember orbs fluttering under the press of heavy eyelids. For a moment Byakuya paused, reluctant to disturb Ichigo before he shoved it aside in the face of curiosity. "What were you laughing about, Ichigo?" Ichigo hummed for a moment as if debating whether to answer Byakuya before he flashed the startled lieutenant a small smile and shrugged. Orange locks were shadowing ember orbs between one moment and the next, so that Byakuya couldn't glimpse the tell of his soul, and Byakuya sighed, acknowledging the rather flippant mood of his friend. Ichigo seemed to sway from happy to contemplative between the span of a second. "Just happy to be alive, and here." Ichigo responded with his normally cryptic message, that Byakuya steadily over the years had come closer to decoding. Still, the ebony-haired lieutenant doubted anyone could truly guess the more than twofold meaning behind Ichigo's statements. He could empathize with Ichigo's words, though. Sometimes a chase of nerves chilled his spine and there was a darkness clouding his heart. Then he would see the sun, or the markets crowded with laughter, and life would snag away that pain. Byakuya guessed it was much the same for Ichigo, though perhaps on a deeper level, as Ichigo possessed a knowledge or wisdom that allowed him both deep insight and great sorrow. That was just the way Ichigo was, mysterious to the last drop but as open as a child at other times. Senbonzakura sometimes nagged him to search deeper for something he couldn't see beneath all the layers of his friend. "Think I'll still be able to keep up with you in a spar? Though I doubt I ever came close to challenging you." Byakuya spoke, pulling the two friends away from the contemplative hush that settled as it usually did between them. Ichigo scoffed in an amused tone, one that was bereft of the pride the nobles usually carried with such a gesture, and turned to consider Byakuya. I don't know, last I remember you were pretty close to Bankai no." Ichigo spoke in slightly teasing tones with that razor-sharp grin that carried only a light mischief. Byakuya considered Ichigo's words. It was true that he was able to manifest Senbonzakura in the outside realm, and he had been training extravagantly to reach Bankai, because damn did Ichigo provide competition, but he doubted he was anywhere near that state with the blade. Byakuya had long ago accepted the fact that he would hardly ever reach Ichigo's level no matter how much training they completed, but that didn't mean he didn't try. Yet he still strived to grow stronger for his friend. He wanted to be able to stand by Ichigo's side, spar with him and lock their blades together, feel their souls through the screeching metal. Ichigo had always been kind enough to encourage Byakuya to do such, always placing limits in their spars or helping Byakuya grow in whatever way possible. Now though he worried that the divide between them was too great. Ichigo had been training for a month straight, pitting Zanjutsu against lieutenants and captains. Not to mention his, relatively, new hollow powers. The changes from the training were already evident within Ichigo. There was a new grace to his steps, because Ichigo had always been graceful and poised, as if he had finally settled into his own skin. Not to mention the ambience of his Reisu, it was like a well deep and seemingly endless with dark shadows playing at the sides. Ichigo slid to his feet, hand resting on Zanjutsu's pommel with an inviting grin lining his lips. Byakuya sighed, though inside his chest his heart leapt at the chance to fight against Ichigo once more, and accompanying that was Senbonzakura's rustle of agreement, the faint scent of cherry blossoms that always seemed to surround him growing potent. Heaving himself to his feet, Byakuya glanced at Ichigo with a raised brow. There was a brush of air and then Byakuya's instincts were snapping at him and Senbonzakura was in his hands flicked up to defend against Zanjutsu's heavy clash. Lengthening his stance, Byakuya pushed back against Ichigo's force with a swell of Reisu, the sharp crash of metal against metal fading in the intensity of their joined blades. Byakuya sprung back, feet sliding in the slick grass, He flicked Senbonzakura in his hands, settling the katana in a firm grip and angling the blade forward. Ichigo smiled, eyes catching the light, and like a mirage in the desert he was gone, the image wavering in heated sunlight. Byakuya swung up as Ichigo aimed an overhead strike towards Byakuya, deflecting the blade to the side. Byakuya ducked low and sidestepped so that he could slash at Ichigo's exposed spine. The orange head made a chiding noise as he whipped around, intercepting Senbonzakura with Zanjutsu's own silver blade. Ichigo leaned in close, their breaths mingling in the space between them, voice breathy and rough with exertion. He said, "I can't show you anything here, would give your grandfather quite the conniption, but some other time." Byakuya nodded, understanding well Ichigo's reasoning. The abundance of hollow Reisu that would come from such ventures would surely worry not only his grandfather but likely half of Soul Society. Ichigo smiled and pushed back, swinging Zanjutsu towards the ground and sending the air swinging in heady vortexes. They pushed forward once more, blades batting at each other in rapid movements that would leave any viewer awestruck and straining to even catch a whisper of metal. Byakuya could sense the difference in strength, while Byakuya perhaps possessed a body slightly more muscular than Ichigo. The firehead was always quick, fleeting movements accompanied by blunt force. Now it was backed by an easy fluidity and Reisu-enforced movements. Snapping his wrist forward to deflect Ichigo's incoming strike, he darted away and raised his hand to hastily cast a Byakurai. Byakuya ducked under Zanjutsu's sweeping graze and pushed himself flush against Ichigo, their blade locked tightly between them. Ichigo smirked and Reisu gathered along his blade in great heaving crescents that sent shivers of warning down his spine. Byakuya darted across the small outdoor sect and hastily raised Senbonzakura to deflect the incoming wave of screaming energy. The crescent-shaped arc of power slammed into him bodily, and Byakuya struggled against the current, drawing on the tranquility and sentience of the sakura petals furrowing through his spirit and power. Byakuya was left panting heavily as the crashing storm of energy finally dispersed, and with it a large portion of his strength. Before he could think to raise a blade to counter Ichigo's strike, the cool touch of metal traced his neck. Looking up through parted ebony strands that cloyed around his sticky skin like honey, Byakuya could see Ichigo's eyes from under the crown of orange. They were vibrant and raging with a soft joy. It was there, Byakuya noted in the strands of grass, that it was okay that he didn't necessarily pose a challenge to Ichigo. It was instead the clashing of their souls that excited them both, the kinship and ease of blade like a dance with no one else. Ichigo extended a calloused palm, and with a returning smile Byakuya grasped it and pulled himself up. At eye level he could once more see the weary ache of sleeplessness in Ichigo's eyes, but it was muted and hidden from Byakuya's prying gaze. Wrapping an arm around Byakuya's shoulders, Ichigo pressed himself against the ebony-haired lieutenant's frame and asked, "Should we head to Rungokai? You can tell me all about the new stores, the latest gossip." Byakuya laughed and nodded at the light tones, feeling the ache that had wormed its way into his heart in Ichigo's absence disappear. With a ruffle of orange locks, Byakuya fled towards the gates of the sixth, ignoring Ichigo's cheerful yelling behind him. Check the description for the links to the author.